everyone, to a new episode of the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Rav Arora, independent journalist based in Vancouver. And today, this is a very special episode that I've been excited about over the last week or so. Today, we're going to be talking about the recent FDA's decision to reject the approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. This is a story I've been following for quite some time. Psychedelics has kind of been a topic that I've been interested in since about late 2021 in my own personal life for a number of different reasons. I've had conversations with Russell Brand, Jordan Peterson, and other individuals about this. And there's a lot of different areas within the broad topic of psychedelics that are worth talking about, ranging from religion and spirituality to science and clinical studies and drug agencies and regulatory bodies. But now with this recent news of the FDA rejecting the approval of MDMA therapy, I thought I'd do a podcast on this. And I really feel like this is going to be the perfect kind of conversation. Really can't think of a better kind of conversation, to be honest, with the guests I have. So first we have Kim Witczak, who has been on the podcast before with my colleague Jay Bhattacharya, talking about antidepressants. Kim has a very powerful but tragic story with her husband, who had passed away several years ago, having committed suicide due to SSRI intake. And she is now a consumer rep at the FDA and part of the advisory committee for the approval of MDMA therapy. And she had voted against the approval. And she had a number of concerns about it, which we're going to talk about. But she's a very prominent drug safety advocate, someone who means really well, and I trust will be able to voice some of the concerns that folks have. So I'm really, really excited to have her on. Thanks for being here, Kim.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we have my friend, Dr. Matt Johnson, who we've had on a couple times before. We had a conversation, I think, last year, generally kind of more broadly on the field of psychopharmacology and its limitations. And then we also had a conversation initially right after the FDA advisory panel in early June. I remember I was just on vacation, but the panel had met and voted against it 9-2, and Matt had reviewed the whole 9-hour meeting, and we spoke about it. So for people who don't know, Matt is most well known for being a prominent researcher at Johns Hopkins University, pioneering some of the early studies alongside Roland Griffiths, who recently passed away, on psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, for smoking cessation, depression, mystical experience. And Matt overall has a background in psychopharmacology and is credentialed as a experimental psychologist. But right now, he's a part-time professor at Johns Hopkins and working as a senior investigator at Sheppard Pratt, the Center for Psilocybin, if I'm getting that right. And he's really the perfect guy to talk about psychedelic science with, because I feel like he generally veers away from the kind of utopian kind of sentimentalism in the psychedelic community, and also on the other side, the kind of mainstream, rigid psychiatric community, which is also not very familiar with psychedelics and often has a very negative or confused bias on these things. It's a very long intro I'm giving here. I'm pretty sure I got that all right. But Matt, thanks for being here again. Happy to do this. Like I was saying, I really think this is the perfect conversation to have. I think you guys are both perfectly set for this. Kim, obviously being on the advisory committee. I guess, Kim, do you want to start us off and maybe give a little bit of background of, I guess, how you were, how you got on this advisory committee and what your thoughts maybe going into it were about MDMA and maybe psychedelic therapy more generally?
Sure. So I have been on the FDA Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee this is my second term. And I got put on it back after I had testified before the U.S. Senate. The FDA commissioner had asked if I wanted to get more involved. And I had been involved with the FDA and basically after the death of my husband back in 2003, so 21 years ago, he was given an antidepressant Zoloft for insomnia with no history of depression. 5 weeks later, took his own life. And interesting, at that point, the night that he was found, the coroner asked if he was on any medication. It was only Zoloft. So we started researching because everything intuitively was like, there's no way he killed himself. But we found out that the FDA had hearings in 1991, right? So then, and did nothing when it was just Prozac. So fast forward, I was like, wait, you guys have known about this issue and did nothing and had no warnings? Here it is in 2003. This was 13 years or 12 years before Woody had died. And so that became my mission, is to get warnings. So that really, I call myself the accidental advocate. I never chose to go do this work. I'm a consumer rep. I represent the public. And so, but I'm really passionate about the discussions because, you know, I have seen my background's marketing and advertising. I've seen how a lot of these drugs and the drug companies come to the FDA, everything being fast tracked and using small, you know, numbers in the clinical trials. And so just different things where I'm often going, yeah, but what's it going to be like in the real world once it's, you know, in the live, you know, in the wild. And so for me, because a lot of the drugs that we have reviewed have been on, you know, from the psychiatric or the psych drugs from the pharmaceutical companies, I was actually really, you know, looking forward to this discussion with the psychedelic, because I know that there is, you know, maybe the current stuff isn't working, right? And there's all kinds of issues. And I've seen with the PTSD, with the vets, and they just keep throwing all these like handfuls and cocktails of drugs. Well, that's certainly not helping people, right? So I was actually looking forward to this conversation, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this could be something that has potential.
Okay. And did you have any kind of opinion or bias that's worth talking about in terms of psychedelic therapy? Any kind of general understanding of the clinical literature or the trials on psilocybin or MDMA? Anything significant on that note?
No, I mean, other than I had been following, like, you know, I watched the Netflix, you know, how to change your mind. Yeah, change your mind. I have a ton of my friends. I mean, I did have friends that that are in research and have, you know, gone to all the psychedelic conferences. And so I've always, you know, I was curious about it. I would say that I had probably more of a favorable wanting to see it because of all of what I've known about the traditional, like the antidepressants. But in terms of like, this isn't my world. I'm in the pharmaceutical world. And so this really wasn't something, and I thought this might be the one where I'm not the only no vote. I might actually be, what if I was the only yes vote? You know, so I was thinking that might be the case because I might see things differently. So that's really what I went into this hearing. But,
okay. Yeah. Okay. And Matt, for you, there's obviously a lot of concerns to talk about, and we'll go through them fairly systematically. But Matt, for you, maybe in case the audience doesn't know, do you want to like quickly summarize kind of your view of MDMA therapy broadly, as someone who's looked at the literature? Obviously you've spent more time with psilocybin, but your general understanding, Matt, of kind of this area, can you just kind of summarize that quickly for audience members who may not know about your view on this?
Right. And it's a nuanced view. I've said publicly that I was leaning, based on the FDA advisory committee meeting and the data, which I was familiar with, of course, before the meeting, that was leaning on the side of approval, but approval with a very strong REMS, that's the risk evaluation mitigation strategies, the rules that the FDA could apply, and with continued monitoring because there are some concerns. To me, just briefly, there were, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 kind of major concerns, depending on how you weigh them, that the committee had or that were at play in the discussion. There's the functional unblinding, which we can discuss any of these. I'm happy to. I didn't weigh that. You know, I thought that was fine. We can explain that later. The the fact that 40% had used MDMA before, I didn't weigh that heavily at all. Again, can explain it later. The areas of a concern that I thought were legitimate for consideration, I mean, it was all legitimate for consideration, to be clear, but the things that I thought really, called into question for serious concern were these allegations of this utopian vision leading to a whitewashing of the data. So both the safety concerns stemming from the phase 2, that's the earlier phase of research, not the phase 3 that puts it up for potential FDA approval, but in the stage before that, there was a very high-profile sexual abuse case, and even the language there isn't of contention in terms of whether this was a post-treatment sexual relationship or sexual abuse. I think it's legitimate to say it was a sexual abuse case that happened during phase 2 MDMA treatment by the sponsor. But then there's also these apparently 3 cases of individuals that claimed that their suicidal ideation had increased after the MDMA treatment, but that wasn't reflected in the data. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. Apparently at the advisory panel, this was the FDA staff that said, those phase 3 concerns about the folks saying that their, suicidal ideation increased, but that wasn't reflected, that's still under investigation. And the individuals that made those claims had said it was sort of part of this, I guess, implicit backdrop of the study therapist saying this could change the world, this could help so many people, you're part of a movement, this type of thing. So they didn't, explicitly say, you got to fudge the data, but it was this like very strong overlay. These are the claims of these individuals.
Yeah, and for people to know, this comes from a Wall Street Journal article. Matt and I had a long phone call talking about it after I found out about it. This came out a couple weeks ago in early August before the FDA decision. And in that Wall Street Journal investigation, there were 3 individuals cited who said exactly what you just said, Matt. Anyway,
right.
Go on.
And so it's, I can say with my own experience from Johns Hopkins, there very much is this cult-like atmosphere. And this is coming from a person who's been interested and like making psychedelics the focus of his career for over 2 decades. There is this cult-like atmosphere that's surrounding the field where there are many of the prominent figures in the field really see, and I'm not exaggerating at all when I say this, but they see this as leading to the survival of the human species. That unless we have the spiritual enlightenment that comes from the adoption of psychedelics in society, like the human species isn't going to make it. And that's very much, even individuals who are, with the reputation of highly respected researchers and rigorous, and like this is pervasive. And so this is something that I've struggled with against one of the reasons why my primary affiliation is not at Hopkins anymore. One of the issues that I've just been encountering friction with over many years at this point. I don't have any inside information about what's gone on with Lycos or MAPS, the sponsor of the MDMA work, but I will say that this kind of general claim is part of the concern. And so I'll say that that's not out of left field. This is a very real thing. And it really takes a lot of principle in this field to, we want to help people. And I believe there's incredible potential to these medications if we use them appropriately. But I also think there's incredible cult potential. I think there's incredible risk for sexual abuse. I think there's incredible potential for clinicians and scientists at this phase to go in to play the role of a guru, because you are literally giving people access to an experience that not all, but many people consider an experience of God, an experience of ultimate whatever, fill in the language, people differ in their language. But that comes with a very heavy burden. And I've been a very strong advocate about not filling in the blanks for people. Like, that's a mystery, whatever that is. I can have my own opinion, but I know more. I can tell you what brain receptors are hit or what psychological support tends to help people in terms of what these ultimate philosophical questions about the nature of reality or God, like participants' experiences. They're the world's expert on their interpretation of that. And my opinion is just my opinion. And I think that's a major problem in the field. So there is a concern about the nature of the therapy and the nature of the therapy that Lykos MAPS has used has come into criticism for not being empirically grounded and kind of it draws from clinical psychological approaches such as internal family systems, which has been critiqued as if it was done correctly, I would say, you could use this as metaphor that different aspects of your psyche or your mental state, you can liken them to different members of your family. There's the father figure, there's the mother, there's the sibling, yada, yada. But the critiques have said that, like, no, as you delve further into this, to the nuances of this therapy and get into that therapeutic community, that they very much feel that they are distinct entities, even, demonic possession, that this is, that's what's going on here, and that there are these disincarnated entities that are inhabiting us. And, of course, that might be true, but as a scientist, there's no evidence for that. Again, that's anyone's theory. So, this is the nature. So my areas, again, my concern.
And actually, just to pinpoint that, Matt,
it was along those lines.
Just to confirm that, was that concern particularly confirmed or validated with Lykos therapists, or just generally? I've heard that general concern about IFS. Was that actually was actual conversations had about demonic possessions, etc., with the Lykos therapists, or you're just saying broadly?
I don't know. I've talked to people that have undergone the MAPS training that have said, yes, this is part of it, but it's held more as metaphor. But also there are folks that have investigated it, like Nishay Devanad, who really kind of prompted a lot of this extra. It was her call that led to the extended advisory committee and the increased scrutiny. And her claim is that when you really delve into this therapy, that it's almost like if one is familiar with Scientology, that there are certain aspects of the therapy that the introductory level person doesn't get access to. Only once they're kind of vetted as being sort of accepted in the system do they get to know the true story, these further layers. And so I don't have it, to be clear, this has all been written about in the public record, in the press. I don't have any inside information, other than to say that this general, claim of a utopian vision and the idea that there might be this implicit, kind of push for this is going to save humanity. And so the ends justifies the means. That's a real thing in this field. And it takes a lot of principle to really, to ride that edge of I think this can really help people if we do it right, but it could really fall off the rails if we don't do it right.
Yeah. And I just want to say I fully agree with those concerns. Matt and I spent a long time yesterday privately talking about some of those things. So those are absolutely valid concerns. But I think, Matt, you and I will agree, and I guess we'll talk about some of the other concerns, and we'll get Kim to articulate some of those. But generally, all of what you said, very concerning, but that doesn't, in my mind, in and of itself, diminish the actual positive results of the MAPS trials, right? Individuals who go into complete remission for their PTSD, individuals with drastic improvements in their symptoms, and a lot of the extensive surveys looking at various patients and how they're doing, a couple months, I think 6-month follow-ups as well they had done. All of that is very, very promising. It's something I've been looking at for a while. Matt, you've probably gone deeper into the clinical data, but the efficacy really is compelling. And Matt, do you want to maybe chime in on that for a second? Because this
So
really
I
is
would say that's
like
correct.
I think the reason why the psychedelic community has been very hopeful or positive about this, and why many people outside of it have also been very interested in it, is because of the 67% efficacy for PTSD, or I think the second study was I think in the 70s range, 72, 73% or whatever. Those numbers are very, very high. And given the current lack of effective treatments for PTSD, which as far as I understand, there's different therapeutic modalities in terms of medication or substances. There's SSRIs, which don't work very well. So there's a lot of concern about that, and a lot of previous excitement given the high rates of efficacy with the MDMA trials.
Yeah, I would say, and correct me, Kim, as being someone on the actual panel, but my impression for the most part is that the concern was more in the safety. FDA is charged with saying this is safe and effective. So it's not just effective, but safe. And sort of it's on the safety side where I thought the more legitimate, again, I was leaning on the side of approval with the right safeguards, but those things in the gray zone for me were more on the safety side. Now, the questions about like the placebo effect and the functional unblinding, you could argue that was on the efficacy side. Is the efficacy really so good given that people knew what they were on? They had all these high expectations. We could talk about that. But my impression was that it's more of that there's this concern about the safety of this treatment, and that we're all of it. So apparently, like not only the phase 2 high profile sexual abuse incident, but there was also the multiple claims at this point in the press, which I think at the time of the advisory panel, the FDA staff said this is still under investigation. But nonetheless, I mean, that creates an atmosphere like what's going on here, that folks underreported in those cases an increase in suicidal ideation. But their claims were that the therapists themselves were sort of so heavy-handed in their enthusiasm for the treatment that this is going to be so important for people and so important for the world that that these three individuals, and perhaps more, we don't know, but these three individuals were reticent to say, yeah, like I've been thinking about, committing suicide more than I was before because I've been made so raw because of this experience, that they didn't fess up about that because they really saw themselves as like a defector, like they're betraying this movement. Like, wow, if I like express myself about this, that may mean millions of people aren't going to be helped with their PTSD. And so that's sort of like this real, so the efficacy to me seemed clear. The only kind of question was about on that efficacy side. But I think because of the blinding, maybe to the committee, both the efficacy may have also been in question.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm going to chime in because I think efficacy was because of, exactly the couple things the functional blinding. Initially when the company, and this is probably a case for all the psychedelics, right? But, originally they went in and the FDA said you should do a low level of MDMA and niacin to that was the original, was so that they wouldn't have that functional blinding. I think that was in all of our I've got so many papers from my research that I spent 30, 40 hours on. And it was, they eventually said, yes, you can go. And there was some reason that they had, because we brought this up in the advisory committee, which was doing an active placebo. So the funny thing is I'm always on all the other, psychiatric drug trials. I'm like, why can't we just have a pure placebo? So here we have a pure placebo, but then this idea of of course, they're going to know if you've done any of these drugs, you're going to know if you're on this drug or not. You don't I still want to know. And they said, well, how the FDA responded was that they, put in the blinding of the therapists to review it, to review their trials. Then they also gave questionnaires for the people to guess if they were on the drug or not on the drug. So that idea of wait, I still want to know who the placebo people were that thought they were higher than a kite, on MDMA. I'm still I was kind of fascinated by that. But anyways, that's a side note. So I think that functional blinding, what were the impacts on the results? And then I think the selection bias, I think this idea, and I think you touched on it, if you're part of a movement, right, and you don't want to maybe really say things are you, what you felt, did it work, did it not? Were you part of the group that, because there was a lot of discussion and it was in the advisory committee about were certain people selected to move on to MAPS Long, which is the one that looked at the durability of the drug. Who were the people? So there was a lot of still questions around this idea of selection bias or of a bias of being on the drug in itself, right? You're part of a movement. You're 40% of the people who had been in this trial of only, the reality is it was only a couple hundred people, right? Total. And so if you had 40% of that, there's already this pro bias of it. So I don't know, does that work? Does it not? So there were questions about efficacy, but I think the bigger thing really came back down to the allegations that you had former clinical trial participants, you had people that were clinicians or, researchers that were in the study, as well as former MAPS, that you had former MAPS people who had left, who raised questions. And so for me, I was wait, if there are questions about the ethics around the clinical trial and the design before it's being put on the market, FDA, I remember even saying to the FDA, are you going to investigate? I'm not talking about the sexual stuff, but which of course they were, that did get brought up by, several of the members. But it was if there are investigations into, or allegations, not even saying it's true, but allegations, that is your job, FDA, that you should investigate. And I almost wondered, in my mind, should you have actually investigated before you brought this to our committee? Because now I don't have faith in you, FDA, because you're bringing something that now you've put a shadow of a doubt in my mind that makes me wonder, if you didn't do the investigation, you can't put the genie. I've seen it too many times. You can't, once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put the genie back in. And so, or it takes, look at what it took for, the antidepressants, 13 years to put a warning on. And it was only through lawsuits that a lot of the safety things get, and eventually investigated. They go into the company's trials, and that's where you find, whoa, you mean they changed suicide to emotional lability instead of saying suicide. And it was seen in the initial clinical trials. So my feeling, and I'm not saying this is, this was Lykos, but it's the idea that if there's allegations of misconduct, you need to do your due diligence before you come and bring it to us, as the committee. So that was one of my biggest things, was just this idea of, there were allegations and you needed to do your, you should go and investigate and not necessarily trust that the company itself, because of course, there's a lot of financial pressures to get it on. There's a lot of also movement pressures to get it on. So that was one. And then the other, and you brought it up, which was the role of therapy. I was super curious from even in the trials, did you compare? Because I remember asking, I didn't know anything about the MAPS. I got into it once I got into the research when, my stacks of research from the FDA, but I didn't I didn't know anything about the MAPS. Like, is that and I asked the question, is this a proprietary type of research for you as a company? And I asked the CEO of that question when we got to ask questions of the company, because I was curious, like, so is this part of it? Like, is it the therapy? Is it the drug? Did you try, and like, did you ever test another more, recognized, therapeutic type of therapy with the drug? Like, I can't tell the difference. And then also at the end of the day, the FDA doesn't regulate therapy. So like, they only, if they're not responsible or regulate therapists, what happens when, is it the therapy or there's issues with therapy? Like, FDA, are you the right people that should be approving it as is? Or should there be another body? Is this an opportunity that we have to approach the whole regulatory system a little bit different and say, you know what, it's got a therapeutic component. Like, how does therapy fit into it? Like, these are just questions. Like, I don't have the answers. I'm just throwing the way my brain thinks, the questions, and why it was really hard for me to say, like, where is it? Because it's novel treatment. This is a novel, and yes, for people like you who've been studying it your whole career, it's probably not novel, but for, I think, the people and the public, like, it's novel. And so how much is it the therapy? And, could we have done, and I don't even know if this is, again, I don't know how you do the trials, you do, but are there lessons from this to help other companies as they're looking at it? And then I'll go back, and then you touched on something, safety, which is, of course, my thing. I was like, really, I have to say, I was pretty surprised that some basic safety measurements, like the heart rate and, the cardiovascular and the liver, I was like, wait, isn't that just like clinical trial 101? And the FDA missed it too, right? So like, they did not. And of course the company could put that in REMS. That is part of the things that they could have followed up with, but that was something in the initial clinical trials. And we know that MDMA does raise like heart rates and stuff. But you didn't actually track that. Like, that just seems basic.
Yeah. And it has, another thing that came up was measuring euphoria.
Yeah.
But sort of like the cardiovascular response, like, this is really well established. MDMA has abuse liability. Like, it does. Like, we've known that for decades. Yeah. And so if they needed that in the trial, there are a plethora of drugs that are approved by the FDA, which do have, including cocaine and amphetamine and plenty of opioids, which have very strong abuse liability, stronger than MDMA. So that in and of itself doesn't bar approval, but if they needed that characterization, like, I don't know the nuances of whether that advice was conveyed and they didn't, Lycos MAPS didn't take it.
I think,
but it sounds to me like, like
that
FDA didn't.
That was missed. That like the whole likability of it was missed from, which it seems like, if you're going to have to, because of you, then you're going to, unlike some, probably like opioids, right? There's the next step that it has to go to the DEA, right? And like I don't know how they deregulate and all that. Like, you would have thought that would have been very important information that would have been needed to ensure with like the DEA to allow it to be now used in, medical forms and, so anyways, these are all things that at the end of the day, were interesting for me.
I'm surprised they didn't track heart rate. That is a little surprising to me that they didn't capture heart rate, Matt. I feel like they should have done that.
Yeah, although there are many studies that have measured the heart rate from MDMA, so how could that be different in a PTSD population? It's an easy thing to measure, even during meaningful, like, heart rate is actually the easiest thing. It's a little bit of an interference, not much to do blood pressure, but heart rate's like the easiest. So yeah, it's disappointing. Like, I don't know where the ball was dropped, whether it's FDA not conveying that if they wanted it, or whether it was Lycos MAPS. In terms of abuse liability, I was going to say, the question to me is like, again, you're going to get like drug liking, ratings of high, whatever there's different ways to do that in terms of subjective effects. But the real question is, for me, is like how many people who have not used MDMA are now using MDMA a year later because they've been introduced by therapy. To me, on the ground, that's like, because we know like people get high in MDMA, we do know that. But again, you can get high in plenty of very effective, prescribed drugs. And so that shouldn't by itself preclude approval. So the real key question is like how many people, started using, or, maybe they used it before, but now it's rekindled their interest. That's a legitimate question. Some percentage will, and we don't know what that is as a field. But it sounds to me like in general, the FDA really didn't provide the guidance to the advisory. I mean, and again, I don't know in terms of the conveyance of information to the Lycos and /MAPS, but also, I would have thought that the FDA would have provided, like a judge will do in court, saying like, look, you can't consider this. This is like, we don't regulate whatever the ruling is. We don't consider therapy. You cannot say anything about that. Like, you cannot weigh this. You've got to act like this is assumed, whatever that ruling is.
No.
But it sounds like it was more kind of hand waving, because if you're a reviewer, of course you're going to ask these questions, and if you get a wishy-washy sort of guidance, because I would hope it would.
But they did say, like the FDA head of the committee, she did say, like, we don't have therapy is not under our purview, right? Like, I mean, she would say that, but I think as people who are on the committee, and that's why, I mean, even one time I said, am I like the right expert? Like, I don't like, because this is how I would approach like any review, like the kind of questions, the FDA does not give us guidance before. We get all of our paperwork. We get a lot of stuff. I mean, literally, I don't get paid for it. I spent probably 30, 35, 40 hours. I mean, I have highlights on stuff. Like, if you went through all my papers, I mean, I have so many questions that I'm just trying to get the big picture, right? But that's about all we get. Like, the FDA doesn't sit there. We don't have any calls in between, like, members. Like, the first time, and truthfully, this was so all of these FDA advisory meetings used to be in person. Then COVID hit, and then it was all virtual. And I have been like, complaining to the FDA, like, get us back, bring people back, not even just, but I want the public to come back. I want the media. I want everybody who has like a story, they can be there virtually and in person.
Right.
But this was their second meeting that they had in person since COVID. And it was only the FDA staff and the company and the advisors. So everybody else from the public had to participate via Zoom, which I like having that option, but it was just a very interesting, but we don't really get any like guidance. And there are things, like I said, that idea that if I was running the FDA or if I was responsible for this, I'm not sure. I know everybody through like a breakthrough therapy application. They had a commitment letter because it was fast tracked, right? That they had to have an August 11th deadline. That was all part of the commitment letter from the FDA. So I kind of feel like, so they needed to do this, but maybe they should have waited until they had done some of their investigations into some of the allegations, because now they put that little bit of shadow of doubt came there. And so it was something that I think a lot of people, and then you had, of course, other members, and I can't speak for them, but that are more into the data and statisticians and biostatisticians and psychiatrists and things like that might have had a different perspective on the committee. Again, I saw, but some of them, and actually this is something that I think is really interesting. The one final yes came from Walter Dunn, who's a psychiatrist at UCLA. I think he works a lot with the vets. He is a former vet himself. So he said, I'm going to vote because I know this is a problem. I'm voting yes. But he said if I was to do a likability of this, the scale of a likability from like 1 to whatever, it's a very, very low likability that I'm giving my yes to. But I think people were conflicted with this. And
what does he mean by likability? Likability as in
likability of the drug. Like, do I really I'm going to give this approval? Is it a full yes, like 100% yes? Or is it like, if I got to put a scale to it, it would probably be on the low end of the scale, is how and I always tell people at the end of advisory committees on anything, they should always listen to the vote and the explanation, because I think there's some, really interesting why somebody voted yes or no. But at the end of the day, I think it wasn't ready. Like, I don't know that this was the one. My big fear is if this would have come out and it came out and then it was done wrong, or these things came forward and came out wrong, does it hurt the entire field of psychedelics? Like, is it ready for prime time? Or is there another one? Because I know there's others coming up. Like, I think there is a psilocybin one coming up. I think Compass, is that right? Compass
Right.
is the next.
Yep.
I think that's the next review. I hope that maybe there's some things that they think about given the kind of analysis that the committee had, because I go back
is
to
taking notes.
Yeah, I bet they did. And
out of hundreds of companies are taking notes.
Yeah, I got to think they are. And so I'm going to go back to something. So, there's always an industry rep who represents the pharmaceutical industry, or, that perspective that sits on our advisory committee. They don't get a vote, but they will like throw comments in, or, like, hey, I just want to give you what it might be like if we're doing from the drug company perspective. Right. So I think for them, it was very interesting. I think she's the chief, like she did all the esketamine trials and, which, she was in charge of that program. And she, like, her thing, she kept saying, I cannot believe some of those basic safety things like the QT interval cardiovascular monitoring and the liver functions weren't done. Like, those are basic 101 clinical trial. And so I just feel like that to me said something from like, if they missed this, what else did they potentially miss? And again, it just put that shadow of a doubt into a decision that didn't necessarily need to be there. Like, I think if, everybody could pull back and do it differently, I'm sure they'd be doing things a lot differently, and probably including get all new members on the committee. But
all right, so we're back here. Yesterday we recorded kind of part one of this conversation, and we just want to pick it up right where we left off because we weren't able to finish it yesterday due to time constraints. This is a very important conversation, and as far as I can tell, no one else is really having this conversation with kind of differing perspectives on this. So we really appreciate all of us getting together and continuing this. We were talking about safety and efficacy, different kinds of therapy. We talked about a bunch of different things yesterday. I think we want to go through some of those things more systematically and kind of wrap up loose ends and talk about a couple of new things as well. We were talking a lot about safety yesterday, and Kim, you brought up the fact that heart rate was not measured in the study. Measures of euphoria. Kim, do you just want to spend like a minute or two kind of summarizing your safety concerns, and then we'll get Matt to respond to that?
Sure. I think, just some basic safety assessments were missed in the initial, clinical trial data, such as, the Lykos failed to document the QT cardiovascular as well as liver monitoring, which are kind of basic, clinical trial, it's just kind of what you do. You kind of see it in almost every one of our reviews of other drugs that we do. That's just kind of basic information. And then I was also, obviously concerned that they didn't measure euphoria. And some of that was it overlooked by the FDA as well, probably. But those are some of my safety concerns, as well as some of the reports during phase 2, which were the reports of the sexual, which was pretty well documented. And those were concerns, as well as I don't know that we necessarily had, the safety guardrails. And I always think it comes back to what are the guardrails once a product does come on the market. So those were some of the safety concerns, but and I know we'll get into some of the efficacy concerns that I had as well.
Yeah. So Matt, what are your thoughts about those particular concerns?
Yeah. In terms of the heart rate and the euphoria, the big questions I have is, did the FDA did they specify that they wanted these things in these phase 3 trials, and then Lykos maps failed to produce them? That this is what I'm not aware of. I don't know how that happened, and if there was a failure of communication, where that ball was dropped. But the big backdrop for me is that we know a lot about MDMA. Many millions, I think it's fair to say hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent largely on the problems of MDMA, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, focused on neurotoxicity and other general toxicity of MDMA. That was actually one of the strong backdrops to, MAPS moving forward with their work, is that it was sort of unprecedented in terms of safety. I mean, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has funded me throughout my entire career for, the problems of different drugs. I mean, they have devoted these massive resources towards understanding the harms of MDMA. So we know very well that MDMA increases cardiovascular response, heart rate, blood pressure. We know very well that it has abuse liability, that it will increase measures of euphoria. What I'm not as familiar with is how, even if that is well characterized, and again, this might be kind of a unique situation with MDMA because so much of this other kind of publicly funded research has been focused on safety long before it got to the point where it was being developed as a drug. So that's kind of unique. That's not like your typical pharmaceutical that's been developed. So, is that information still required in the phase 3 trial? I mean, to me, just scientifically, it's sort of theoretically, it could be the case. Well, that could differ slightly in PTSD patients, unlike previously studied populations, but not very likely at all. I mean, these are people, that comes down to more to do with, are the inclusion exclusion criteria similar? If people have the same sort of general range of medical status coming in, it's extremely likely that the cardiovascular response is going to be the same. So those are just sort of my thoughts on that, we do know that people at more severe cardiovascular risk should be screened out, because as someone, if a physician was considering Adderall or another, amphetamine type stimulant, that someone at cardiovascular risk would be screened out. That's going to be the case and should be the case for MDMA, because it does have that cardiovascular load. So, what I'm not familiar with is that, was this a specific requirement, which to me doesn't seem like was needed scientifically, but perhaps that was needed in a specific population. And if it wasn't provided, then I don't know where that ball was dropped. And very similarly on the abuse liability, obviously MDMA has abuse liability. It's been abused since the 1980s in the club scene and dance scene, and it's just generally, I mean, that's where it started out. But people like to get high on MDMA, that. We definitely know that, and there's been substantial research into that, and so that doesn't preclude it being approved as a medication, prescribable medication. It has implications for how it's the adjustment of the schedule status for it, and it has implications for the REMS, the rules that the FDA can impose if it approves it. And
and it suggests things like it may be appropriate to have, like with similar medications with abuse liability, like very limited access. There's things like you could have a single central distribution pharmacy, things like this, where you can tightly control distribution, prevent diversion. So it has implications for that, but we know what that answer is going to be. Like, yep, you can get high in MDMA, and it increases your heart rate and your blood pressure. And so kind of those are my general, thoughts on that. So it's just a real shame that, if that were the issue alone, and I know it wasn't, and that's what I'm like really curious about. What was the ultimate weighting by the FDA of what really killed it, and how did they weigh or was it really death by 1,000 cuts where each of these multiple factors maybe wouldn't have been enough to constitute a failure by itself, but through their summation, somehow it constituted a failure. But if it was these issues by itself, the abuse liability and the cardiovascular response, I would think, oh wow, well, that seems kind of more like a bureaucratic failing. And again, I don't know who dropped the ball on that, whether it wasn't asked for or whether it should have been expected by the sponsor or they didn't heed the FDA advice. But just as a scientist, like, we know those answers pretty darn well. And so that would have been a shame if that was the only issue. And so that's why in my, armchair assessment, I've kind of weighed those factors low. Like, if it were to be approved, it would be approved in a way like, Adderall and Ambien and Spravato and a litany of other medications that have well-known, people like to get high on this stuff. And so we're going to regulate it accordingly. So that's just, well known. And you can assume the worst, like, yeah, it's a very abusable drug. And so we're going to treat it as such. And it has cardiovascular risks. So there should be similar screening to, like that was implemented in the trials.
One quick follow up. Just got one quick follow up before you respond, Kim. Which is Matt. We had in our podcast in early June, we were talking about MDMA risks, and you said you weren't like 100% sure, but you said you were very, very confident, or at least you have never heard of, say, like a fatality or heart attack or any like serious life threatening cardiac outcome in any MDMA trials since the early 2000s, which there are many trials.
And importantly, with which have this screening, which screen out identifiable cardiovascular, because there have been deaths in the illicit use of MDMA for sure. But yeah,
that is an important fact to know. I mean, like if there were MDMA trials where you have even one person with a heart attack or myocarditis, heart inflammation, or stroke or something like that would be of concern. But from what you had said, as far as there are no trials showing any severe cardiac outcomes in the screened population.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any, and I'm certainly all ears if, Kim, having been on the advisory panel, may be aware of something I'm not, but I'm not aware of any. And I will say it's a different type of evidence. It's weaker evidence, but as I said, there are obviously people like any illicit drug that have had such, adverse events, and there have been deaths with MDMA abuse. But I have to say, across and compared to other classes of, illicit drugs, it is pretty astonishingly how low the death rate is, even amongst people taking MDMA that's often adulterated and is often and even typically taken in the environments that we know are not optimal, but actually like the worst, for, heated, crowded environments,
dehydrated,
where people are drinking alcohol, dehydrated, etc. And, the rates are, I don't know that anyone really has a great activity estimate, but so many out of like 100,000, a few out of 100,000, which is 100% tragedy to all those people who have passed away, to be clear. But I will say compared to opioids or cocaine, like you step back and it's a pretty small death rate, even amongst, illicit drug use. And so it's something I don't want to overstate for sure, because like there are people who have died from taking MDMA, and cardiovascular issues are a risk, but it is something that I would take all of this data into consideration. And if, to me, it comes down to in the approval process is, can the FDA require, will they require, like, here are the criteria, like you have to have, and how reliable can that be? Like, here are the, inclusion criteria. If resting blood pressure and heart rate is above these thresholds, then you can't run somebody. And how faithfully is that going to be adhered to? And including things like, if you test it 20 times and look for the best number, when you get some variation, like, you have to keep that in mind. So, those were just sort of the consideration. That's why on those factors, I would have leaned towards, from my knowledge base, would have leaned towards the side of approval. But the real question is, with the appropriate safeguards, with the appropriate REMS, the rules that the FDA could apply surrounding for whom and how it's used.
Yeah, Kim, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know that the missing, heart rate monitoring and the liver necessarily was what killed it, because I don't know that we had that much discussion around it. I think it was more the idea that those are pretty basic kind of standards in clinical trials, and definitely the ones that we have seen before. I mean, obviously this is a novel treatment, all of that. I think it had more to do with, the fact that those are basic, and if they missed some of the basic, were there other things that were, it kind of just puts that cloud over. And so I don't think, in my mind, I would highly doubt that, because I think that could have been something that would have been and could have been addressed in like REMS, or could the company have gone back and provided it? Did they have it somewhere? They just didn't have it in the research that they gave us. Like, I don't know, I feel like that could have been, but I think it's more the idea is those simple, basic things kind of combined with everything else that, that was there to do with data and, allegations and with the trial participants and, the researchers, that former researchers, former employees. I think in my mind, it was all of the death. I think you said it earlier, death by 1,000 cuts. I think there were probably a lot of things that cast a shadow of,
that makes sense.
Yeah. And I just want to say, I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that like the safety tests that were done or not done, that it was all, the design was approved by the FDA. Like if the FDA wanted the heart tests, they would have made Lykos do those heart tests, and they didn't. So
I think
that's what I don't know.
I think it was an oversight. I really think it was an oversight that somebody missed it, because those are normal, basic things. So I don't know if it was FDA, if it was just when they went through, but protocols are established, right? You do, when you come in, the companies meet with the FDA, they decide on what the protocols were, how they're going to do the testing, who's included, who's not, like all of that gets approved, right? But I always say, and one thing that even with REMS, we have seen that a lot of times REMS don't get followed up on in the real world, right? Once it's out in the wild. That's always, and we also have to remember clinical trials are always under best case scenario, right? It's always, because you want the best case, you want to show that the drug, you want to get the benefit of why you do trials. And so who are the right people? So that's just, I always say that because sometimes we forget that, that trials are usually designed with the best people, the most ideal people. But does that necessarily, like to your point when you just said, when it comes down to it, are they going to do 18 different tests to find that one test that shows that their heart rate's in the right?
Right.
They just want it, I mean, so those are, but that we're not going to, that's going to be an issue once it's on the market, that those aren't usually what the FDA is looking at. when, or at least the advisory committees are looking at the time when there's a hearing that comes down the road.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to add on that, Matt, before we move on to some of the other concerns?
That makes sense, and I can understand the rationale. It sort of makes me think of, if you have a key witness in a trial and they've been shown to forget some relatively minor fact, it's like that fact itself may not be, super relevant to the case, but it calls into question the ability of this witness to remember things accurately. And so, how much can you trust? How much can you weigh? Like, if they screwed that up, yeah, I get that. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It's a difficult call.
Again, obviously with the caveat that we don't exactly know. And I'll text Rick or something or ask him if he can answer the question. If the FDA told them that they wanted those tests, and if they did, what's going on there?
Because you have some really credible people, involved with with Lycos that have been with, like the CEO is, comes from pharma, and I don't have any special knowledge, any inside knowledge, but I would assume that if the FDA said we want this, and that, they would be damn sure to be like, we're going to get, especially with things that are so easy to get, like the things we've been talking about, like they're just not, liver, so what, you get a blood sample, after treatment, you get, and however many time points out, how much did you like that drug? How high were you, whatever, for euphoria or, and, blood pressure and heart rate, just the easiest thing in the world to assess. So just huge curiosity more than anything about that. Gosh, with these simple things.
I bet it was, I think you're right. I don't think a company would, if the FDA said do it in something basic, they're going to say no. You know what I mean? So I have a feeling it was just a general miss. But regardless, it's a miss. If it was a miss, that was part of the information that was before, the advisory committee. And, obviously the time between the advisory committee meeting in June and the FDA's approval or lack of, they could have been asking, who knows what really went on. We don't ever get privy. Once we're done, like what I think I said it before, when we're done, we don't ever even hear back. We hear back when we hear it in the news, whatever happened. So there's no communication with an advisory committee once we're done.
And to wrap up the kind of safety / adverse events side of the conversation, so you have the one case of sexual abuse, which you talked a bit about yesterday as well. And I will say it is quite unfortunate that MAPS, Lycos, MDMA therapy has gotten this horrible association with this one anomalous case of this crazy therapist and his wife, and what happened there, the sexual relations with their female participant in the study. From what I understand, MAPS at the time did appropriately respond to it by reporting to the FDA right away. I guess maybe we could spend a second on the issue with psychopharmacology, the retraction, which was, from what I understand, that MAPS went to the FDA about that adverse event, that sexual abuse case, but not the journal itself, which led to that retraction. Matt and I were talking a bit about that. That doesn't seem to be good cause for a complete retraction, maybe a correction, because it doesn't really take away from the rest of the efficacy and safety data that they collected. But I would say it's unfortunate that had to happen that way, and that associations kind of come with MDMA when it's really just one crazy incident that should never happen again, but it doesn't represent all of MAPS or Lycos or MDMA therapists.
I think but that idea of the sexual, abuse, granted it was phase 2, granted they addressed it, but I think there was a lot of question, at least from the members, of the type of therapy and how the therapy is the one male, female, who are these people? It was just the whole idea of, there was so much unknown around therapy and then having the FDA say that they're not, they don't regulate therapy. I think there were some concerns like, could this happen again? Like and again, maybe this could be stuff that could have been addressed in a REMS program, or, how you would, ensure that something like that doesn't happen. But I think there were kind of questions, and I don't think that the people, there are some people on the committee that said, in their mind, and that just seems like you can't walk away from something, especially because not all PTSD, I think, and one of the questions that I did have when I was going through it in the trial, were they vets or were they sexual trauma? What is like PTSD, we tend to always think is like a veterans coming back from VA, but if it's sexual trauma is part of PTSD, and those are going to be some of the people that are using it, is that, and potentially could that be an issue? And so I think we can't, just like, oh, that's unfortunate, just those people, but how do you ensure that something like that doesn't happen in the way it would roll out to the market? I tend to think, I don't want to think that that's going to happen, right? Who wants to think? But, somebody clearly in phase 2 did take advantage of the situation, and it's unfortunate. And I don't have a clue what happened with the retraction, but it seemed like it was a lot around that not being included, but yet it was a known thing. So I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
I don't.
It seems
I would have a similar response in the sense that I would not want to assume that it's a one-off, because to some degree, it is a signal of what's a potential with this treatment. And I certainly believe there's a path forward that we can improve this under the right rules, where we can do our best to minimize that potential. But the data are really jaw-dropping on just according to some data, 3% of therapists, not psychedelic therapists, 3% of therapists have had sexual relationships with a patient. That's jaw-dropping. Mm-hmm. And I'm not familiar with the numbers in medicine, like psychiatry, but I assume it's going to be similarly astonishing, so you just know this is going to happen. And I think it's a very safe bet to assume that it's going to be a higher rate, because you get to the levels, and I've been in dozens of these psilocybin sessions and some other psychedelics, dextromethorphan, salvinorin A. These are some of the most intimate moments of a person's life. There are numerous times people have said that they're sharing things that they haven't shared with their spouse. They are so they reveal this core. They're crying like a baby. They're revealing. They're exploring their deepest, most shameful in some cases secrets. People are raw. And so the potential is only higher. Now it's impossible to extrapolate how frequently this is going to happen, other than I would say that single case in the phase 2. And to be clear, it wasn't the phase 3 data under consideration, but it was the phase 2, the earlier phase research. But it does show that this is a possibility, not surprisingly at all, but this can happen. And I would say, and I know the accuser and others have made this point, and I agree with it. It was a nominal relationship that extended beyond, but that's not how the accuser is, what they, claim is that under these circumstances, it was abuse, not a relationship. That's why I say nominal relationship, because they're saying that's not a relationship, even if by the same justification that, what do you call it? Statutory rape. But if a person underage consented to it, no, that's not, they can't consent. There's something inherent about the power dynamics of that relationship where it's not right. So even if it looks like a relationship, it's not. So that's the claim. And so I've been hesitant to even use that term relationship. It sounds like it was an abusive situation, where certainly that experience.
And I think you just brought up something, that whole power dynamic too, right? With, I think that is something that, again, the committee did talk about in context of the therapy and what it is with the two therapists and like power. There's always going to be a power dynamic. And I know that they said one female, male. And I think, that's, and then under the influence of something that already kind of makes you a little bit more suggestible and a little bit more open or raw. And so that is something that I think you can't just say it's a one-off and not take it serious. But at the same time, I think there's, things that could be done or would need to be done in like once it became something, if it was going to be real. Because there was a lot of conversation of like, who are these therapists? Are they, especially because this was very Lycos specific. And I remember asking the CEO, is this proprietary therapy to you? Like, do they have to be trained by you? Is that part of the business model that they have to be your licensed therapist? And then are they therapists, or then it became like there was discussion of like, oh, it has to be male, female, but then maybe one's a licensed therapist. Somebody else could just be somebody working in the office. Like there was discussion like that. Right. So I think there was, that also added to and you could put that under safety, under the safety part of this conversation, because, and especially when the FDA doesn't regulate that part of any, they kept saying they don't regulate medicine, they don't regulate doctors. However, this is different because it's the drug plus therapy. And so this was a novel, new, that I think I'm going to still go back to what I've said before. This, maybe there was a whole different, this might be a time that the FDA actually has to think about, are they the right people? Are there other is there an opportunity to like have joint kind of discussions or approvals or something when there's therapy involved? If they're not regulating it, then we need to really talk about like, because if somebody reports into the FDA, right? So everybody can, and I talk a lot about harms, and you can report anything into the FDA's website or MedWatch, which is the VAERS program. So if I report into the VAERS, but I, say I was on MDMA-AT and here's what happened, at what point, like, what if it's like not, is it the drug or is it the therapy? And then if it's the therapy, does the FDA just go, well, not ours, and we're going to like turn it over to, do they turn it over? Because a lot of times harms do not get investigated through anything that gets reported at the FDA. So what is the system when something does happen is, if somebody does report and it's a therapy related, does it actually go to a therapy board? And then if it's like the medical boards, a lot of time the medical boards side with doctors and not side with patients that have been harmed. And that's kind of a known thing with like just medical doctors. So the societies and the associations. So I think there's a lot of just not super clear. And that's also like part of that safety guardrails that I talk about is like what systems are in place. FDA, and I'm asking the FDA, I wasn't really even asking the Lycos because I think it would have had been a combination, but it's really like if people do report in, what's in place, like how does this work for the average person that comes in if they do have complaints? I mean, even now, just looking at the people who were in the trials who were trying to get get it looked at, they had difficulties. So anyways, those are some of the issues that I still kind of put under safety guardrails, on this. And I think I don't know that it's necessarily going to be specific to Lycos. I think this is a conversation that I think the FDA has to actually think about for other ones that are dealing with therapy, right? Like, how does it work? And I don't have the answer. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, and I think, and I was going to say it before you mentioned it, but at least under the current framework, as imperfect as it is, it would be the state level medical boards, which is state regulated, and it's not federally, regulated. But as you're saying, there's this bias. This is sort of like the police unions and similar.
Protect your own.
Is there a bias towards protecting the physicians? And then and I'm a strong advocate, and even though states differ, and there's some states that allow even clinical psychologists to administer a subset of drugs like SSRIs. I want a physician, and I'm saying this as a psychologist, I want a physician's license on the line. If something goes wrong, obviously they're going to have help. They don't have to be the person in the room. It can be a psychologist. It could be a therapist. But if they're not overseeing that and something goes wrong, there needs to be a consequence, their career's over. Mm-hmm. And obviously that would have to be something really bad, but that needs to be one type of consequence. But we had to have faith that that's going to happen. At the same time, I don't think we're going to see this immediate transformation of a new federal agency that regulates this gets into literally constitutional issues, right. And it's just not going to happen. And so with a lot of the stuff similar to the blinding issue and the difficulties there, what I'm really concerned about is that there's just this impossible standard that's just never going to be met, even though a lot of people could potentially be helped. Mm-hmm. Are we waiting for, what is that standard going to be? And to address something else that you said, I think that this question of therapy is going to come up. A warning for the field is that most of the sponsors coming up they're taking a different route. They're going with, it's not therapy. In fact, they're avoiding the word therapy like a plague. And in fact, a lot of these people are Compass are wiping their brow saying, we got it right, when they saw what happened at the advisory panel, because they're this is exactly why we're not calling it psychotherapy, because of all the questions about the therapy coming up and the monitoring of the therapy. And, what the hell is this type of therapy, which is they kind of use this new age, kind of very idiosyncratic. I think they would have been on better ground to use cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure therapy or EMDR. Those are kind of the big three in terms of we know as therapies, as psychotherapies, these have a decent efficacy, much better than SSRIs for treating PTSD. I would have thought they have been on better ground, but the other sponsors are typically avoiding that. Now, I think there's a nuance that whether you call it nominal therapy or not, I would hope there needs to be the support. There needs to be a rapport building, and I don't know what the magic numbers are. Something like a couple of hours at least. You don't want to be in there with a stranger. You want to have a rapport so that you can simply provide the interpersonal support, and you don't want to leave someone in the room by themselves. And so I think these types of things really, even if we're not calling it therapy, it's therapy-like, whether it's therapy or not. And so it's going to be perhaps even more difficult with future sponsors in the sense that they're going to say, oh, no, this isn't therapy. But really the same range of issues can come up. Well, at least a subset of the issues are going to come up. The person's still in a super vulnerable state, the risks of, sexual abuse and, all the issues, the abuse issues that can come from that vulnerability and the power dynamics, that's going to be just as much at play. It'll perhaps avoid the questions about, adherence to the therapy manual and this type of thing. But it's going to get complicated, and how do we?
It might have to have a whole new. I remember saying I asked the FDA person that was in charge of and I said, "Are you do you have the right people in place to be approving this? Is this an opportunity? Should there be somebody else in this space, whether it's the therapy plus the psychedelics? Do you have the right ability to approve it? Because if it's not, and I don't know, it was just a question I was asking because it seems like it's going to keep coming up, right? Even like when you just said the blinding, and I'm curious. So I was going back and looking at our paperwork where originally the agency had asked to make this is what the agency asked the applicant to provide a plan to mask the identity of placebo, suggesting the use of niacin or low dose of MDMA as comparator, so it would have enough physiological effect on placebo. So, and that was the initial FDA recommendation. And and the company did not go that direction, and the FDA obviously ultimately agreed. But so is that going to be a problem? And this is a question for you. What is the limit? Is the idea of the functional blinding, is that going to always be an issue if they're using an inert placebo? Or do you think there has to be, because, the antidepressants and all of those other psych drugs use some type of active placebo to actually kind of, and I've always said, no, I want them to use an inert placebo, which is funny because that's where you can see some of the safety things, right? But on this case, in this situation, what do we do with this idea of an inert? Because you're going to know, if I'm in a trial and I'm getting psilocybin and I don't, either it's going to be really in my head that I'm thinking, ooh, this is great. But you're going to know, you're going to always deal with this as an issue, aren't you? And so should there be some kind of, active placebo that could be used? If there was in this case, would that have made a difference?
This is a really important issue that we definitely are going to talk about in a sec. But just to wrap up, you were talking about regulation of therapy. I think you're bringing up some important concerns about these protocols. It's MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in the trials, and the FDA, from what I understand, doesn't have any experts on therapy. And should they have review boards or someone in the position of judging the different kinds of therapy? I think that's a really important conversation to have, and I feel like that's something that they could require. It's feasible to me that it could have been approved, but with some very strict guidelines and rules about how adverse events could be captured and how this therapy could be reviewed. And I'm curious.
They may not have the right, though. They don't. FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, so I'm no attorney, so that's grain of salt with all of this. But that might be a big ask to say, they probably just can't decide to have a division that regulates the therapy because they just don't have the legal justification. The history of the Republic is that, we have whittled away in terms of the restriction is unless it's explicitly reserved to the federal government, it goes to the people and or the states. And yes, that's by precedent, that's been whittled away in different spheres where the federal government has gotten more and more power. But nonetheless, there is that, in our federalist system, that is a reality where, and I think that's where the current line is at, that the states regulate the practice of medicine. And the FDA has this, through precedent, they ended up in this position that they regulate the drugs themselves through, historically, I believe, just the fact that it's interstate commerce is involved, which is often the loophole to justify, the regulatory authority there. But, I don't think they have the legal authority to regulate the practice of medicine. So it may not be as easy as just the FDA might want to do that, but they may not even have the legal authority.
But see, I'm going to say that if this is going to be something, and if I was the FDA person, I'd be okay, what would I need? How, if I was going to, knowing that this is going to be an issue and it's going to keep coming towards us, would I want, because, the FDA can go to Congress, and if there's something that needs to change, there are ways that we could, if this is something even having a bunch of like, could there have been therapists? And I always say this, like, on different advisory committees, like sometimes we're talking about drugs for kids and there's nobody who's actually talking about who actually practices drugs for kids, is a doctor for kids. Right. So like, I feel like maybe the could there have been like a subcommittee of something that the FDA is working on to kind of come up with what could be some of those good practices, even for advising companies that are coming forward, if therapy, and they don't regulate therapy. Like if, obviously we know with Lykos, it was very specific, but and they didn't test it against other known and accepted therapy. But I think it's going to continue to be an issue. And if the FDA needs different support, what is it? And does it need to, because I know like the practice of, yes, you're right, the practice of therapy, but I think because therapy is a part of it, it somehow has to be a part of the approval, or there has to be I don't know if you can just approve the drug, because then isn't that just like, that's the illicit street drug that you're approving, but it's actually
right. And there is a gray area because, the FDA label often, I think probably usually, maybe almost always contains information about the conditions under which it's used. Administer, X number of doses, every so many hours. Don't, take with food, take without food. So there's kind of like this continuum of like, what is that context? So they can say something about the context in which this medication is administered. To what degree is like delivering this form of therapy, like, oh, take this with food or without food, or again, it's like, anesthetics, like you can't just get, unless you're Michael Jackson, you don't get, thankfully, propofol administered like to take home. They're like, they can regulate, apply these rules surrounding like this medication has to be used under these conditions in this way. And so you could argue that even though they're not, supposed to regulate the practice of medicine or therapy, that this is similar to those other conditions where they do have some role in dictating the way in which the medication is used. So there is a gray area there, I think. And it might be up to you might have another podcast, Rav, with some attorneys to tease this out,
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting, in some ways, I've said with this, we have an opportunity, obviously, for the people who've been studying it for a long time. It feels like they've been studying it for a long time and this was going to be their show, right? But I think for the FDA, has the FDA been thinking about it as long as these companies have been thinking about it? Probably not. And so these are the kind of questions that, should they have been thinking about it? I'm sure it's really frustrating for the companies who are like, we've been talking about this for how many, decades and, years, and you guys are now just thinking about it. So I think if this is going to be something, the FDA has to actually get a little bit more serious about having these kind of conversations that we're having, and we're not the ones in the role of that get to make the decisions. But because I can understand if I was a company, I'd be like, we've been talking about this for a long time, and you guys are now just like understanding that like you don't regulate therapy or you don't do this. And, I think I would hope that these kind of conversations we're having on the outside, the FDA is having on the inside.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones that can actually fix and knows what can happen. But like, but to me, it just seems like this is why it still feels like it can't be rushed without these thoughts. But yet to the companies, they're probably thinking, we've been talking about this for a long time. So I can understand that frustration.
Yeah. I think that, again, it's worth emphasizing that the FDA approved the design of these studies, right? And so, to approve the design, and then again, we don't know the exact reason why it was rejected. We don't have access to those particular reasons. But if this is a big part of it, that's really unfortunate, and I would say fairly unfair. that if you approve the design early on, you knew it included psychotherapy, and then to turn around and say, well, we don't approve therapy. That's, one big piece of it. That I feel like is really unfortunate. And I feel like therapy broadly, I guess it's occurring to me that there's kind of two different perspectives one could have on this FDA decision, or in this general approval of this first psychedelic-based therapy, which is that if you're solely concerned about minimizing harm from an FDA-approved drug therapy, then, Kim, you're bringing up some very valid concerns. But if you're more concerned about optimizing benefit and giving help and relief to people suffering from PTSD, which is, last I checked, about 13 million individuals in the U.S. struggling with PTSD. I think the number is about 20 individuals committing suicide due to PTSD every day. If that is more your concern, then you would lean more towards approving it, but having, as Matt has suggested before, some very rigorous and strict post-approval guidelines and protocols.
And monitoring.
And monitoring. So those are kind of two different perspectives. And I understand, Kim, for you mentioned in part one of this that once the genie comes out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in. And with your story with antidepressants and the tragic passing of your husband, you're very concerned about drug safety. People in the psychedelic world, on the other hand, whether it's scientists like Matt or just in general activists, academics, therapists, for them, MDMA has been used from Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, since the early 80s and 90s, right, when it was used therapeutically. And then all the studies happened, and then there were this big scare. Right. Kim, I don't know if you know, there was a big scare that it was potentially neurotoxic, and it was later found that there was these very deceptive and misleading studies, and in some cases, outright fraudulent studies on MDMA, that MDMA creates holes in the brain, can lead to dementia or Alzheimer's or these serious neurological disorders. And a lot of the research behind that was complete garbage. So there's all this scare. Well,
I would clarify, it is neurotoxic, dose and frequency dependent. What was the big and what resulted in the retractions, it was thought that it was toxic to the dopamine system, and it could lead to, a single use could lead to Parkinson-like symptoms. They accidentally used a really high dose of methamphetamine in those studies. But it is extremely well established hundreds of times over that it is neurotoxic in the serotonin system. Where the real questions lie is, you get that at extremely high doses with very high frequency in animal studies. Like, at what level is that a clinical concern? And frankly, many, many, many drugs are neurotoxic. Most of the psychiatric drugs, I would say, at a certain dose and at a certain level. I mean, and there are certain ones that are like very horrific, like the classic antipsychotics are just known. Like, you give this enough, like the person's going to have permanent motor damage. But it's the person's having like these florid like hallucinations that are destroying their life and ruining the lives of those around them every day. And so risk benefit, so that's more of the question. I would say I haven't seen any evidence that, 2 or 3 administrations along the lines of, 3 administrations in the phase 3 study for MDMA, that there's any evidence that leads to any clinical, concern, any measurable, neurotoxic damage. So sorry for that caveat, but I had to get that in there because there is a kernel of truth that
it's a good
caveat. You do know that it's a neurotoxic drug. It was,
right, but not neurotoxic in the doses that are being given in the setting.
Right. And certainly not to the dopamine system when that was the big scare that was all based on.
That was whatever, like 100x, like some massive multiplier of the dose.
Yeah, it was the wrong drug. It was methamphetamine, which has been known to be neurotoxic to the dopamine system for a long time. Yeah.
So before we go on to the functional blinding, like that, I feel like Kim, if you have any thoughts on that, generally, like I feel like there's kind of different worldviews here. Like, again, if you're minimizing harm and you're really focused on safety, which you are, Kim, the concerns you're bringing up are valid. But if you're more focused on, PTSD and providing solutions and treatments for individuals struggling when there are very few and there's a high dropout rate, then I guess the kind of pro psychedelic bias, people who done it or who've been working in this area, researching it for years and years. They're like, here's something that could really, really help. This is a therapy, which I feel like maybe earlier on in this conversation, we could have maybe summarized a little bit. But for people who may not know, this is like 5, 6, 7 hour sessions with MDMA, which puts you in a state where your fear centers are radically reduced, activity in the amygdala, and the memory centers are heightened. So you're working through these traumatic memories are coming up, but you're approaching them with far less fear. So things that you would otherwise run away from, it's much more easier to process them and to work through them with much less fear and paralyzing terror. And so, in a given session, 5, 6 hours, you're put in this place where you're able to work through things that you otherwise wouldn't be in, say, talk therapy or something that SSRIs just wouldn't possibly help with in that particular way. So people in the pro psychedelic community, people who've been looking at this for a long time, they're very much going to be favoring towards let's approve this with these particular considerations and protocols, because we know this is really going to help. And, yes, there are concerns about therapy. And yes, there might be this inevitability of there might be some lunatic therapist who starts sleeping with his, participants. And yes, there might be, some very small percentage of individuals with suicidal ideation potentially after it. But we know the established safety of this. We know the efficacy of this, which the phase 3 trials prove. So we should lean more towards, providing solutions for veterans and individuals who've experienced sexual trauma and all other kinds of trauma that don't fit the kind of stereotypical, went to war and came back, suffering from PTSD.
Yeah.
What do you think of that, Kim?
I think you're exact. I mean, that is something that every single time that we look at is like the risk benefit, right? It's risk benefit all the time. I mean, that's like the efficacy. And I think for me, like I said in the beginning, I actually was looking forward to this because I know that there are issues with antidepressants and how we're throwing those at vets or at people with PTSD, and that's not really helping. But I think there were still questions around the efficacy of this trial, with the numbers. And I think it had more, again, I'm not saying it because I actually was hoping for me, it was the allegations of things, of the potential of biases with 40% with the functional blinding, with the people, like 40% had used it, who actually got moved forward. I think when you have allegations from people who were participants, you had allegations from former investigators as well as employees, talking about the construct of the actual clinical trial results. I feel like you have to investigate those before you can, it's always that balance of caution versus hope. And everybody wants hope. And I want hope for people. Already, and since this, this hearing, I've gotten so many emails from people saying that I don't give a shit about people dying. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is why I do care. And even so, I do care, and I want it to come out right. And so it's really frustrating because I do want something. And I also get frustrated because I know what we're doing. The antidepressants don't necessarily work, so they put an antipsychotic on it, and then they put layers and layers of other drugs that is not helping people at all. And so I do want something. So my whole thing with the efficacy was more like, if these allegations existed in the initial clinical trials, you, FDA, just need to investigate them. I'm not even saying that they were right or wrong. Investigate them. And then when you investigate it, because you can't, we found with the antidepressants only through litigation, when you got into the company actual documents from their files, that's when you actually saw that the companies knew that suicide and violence existed, but they intentionally they coded it like emotional lability. They didn't say suicide, so they hid it from the regulators. They hid it from the public and from the doctors. So my whole thought was, if you're getting allegations that you know about before it's even on the market, why don't you just go investigate it so that we don't have to learn down the road that, oh, it was actually in the initial clinical trials of like the idea of bias. And so, because this was in such an environment of hype and like, wanting something new, and I want something new too. So I think, it's just, that was my whole thing on the efficacy. Just go investigate these things that you're saying are biases, go do that, FDA. And I think, and I don't know, maybe this is going to be an issue in all of the future. And I hope it's not, because I do think that there is a real potential with all the psychedelics. And I want to see something out there that actually helps. And I also have said, is there an ability to, with a lot of times with there's drugs that they're doing investigation, is there a way, and maybe it can only be done if there's FDA approval, but aren't there like studies that people can still be joining in, even though it's not approved? Like they have, you can do that when there's a study that's, with the FDA, when they're trying to get a drug approved, there's still pathways that patients can go and get that drug. But I don't know, because it's the MDMA, if that same pathway exists. And with like all the DAs. So anyways, that's all I say.
Yeah.
I mean,
And just to clarify, Kim, when you say you were hoping the FDA would investigate what exactly?
Just allegations of clinical trial misconduct from what we heard in the public comments. It was in some of the the idea of there were people, the investigators, participants, employees that came forward saying that there were allegations of misconduct in the clinical trials. I don't, that's not for me to go investigate. This is why I think should the FDA have actually, it was hard for me to vote yes, even though I was thinking that I was going to, coming into it or wanting to. It was hard for me to do it when the FDA, when they said, "Oh, well, we haven't even investigated." I'm like, "I like you knew."
And they said that during the hearing.
Yeah, they
say, and we're not, to be clear for the audience, we're not talking about the phase 2 sexual abuse like case. We're talking about these instances, including what was reported in the Wall Street Journal, maybe this and more, of at least 3 individuals that said, "Oh, I had an increase in suicidal ideation, but that wasn't recorded because I felt like there was this pressure, this implicit pressure." And so that's what I assume the FDA was referring to when
I don't know. I mean,
and so but it's almost like, you're charged, Kim, and others to like weigh in on this, but like, oh, this major question has been raised, but they're like, we're not going to give you resolution on that. Like and I don't know what their authority is. Like a lot of my answers are like this. I don't know what the FDA is able to do, but if I was the king of the FDA, I would have been like, we're going to give this a 6-month pause. And I know they were under this guideline to get back to the sponsor by this amount of time, but given the way it turned out, I bet like Lycos Maps would have been like, oh, like if you, rather than getting rejected, please take the 6 months to consider, like, okay, investigate the thing. Cause you can do things like, give us all the data without those cases. Give us the data in this other, like, it may have been that an answer was possible, and it may have been that there were some answers for the committee and the FDA itself that could have been brought to bear. Like, oh, now we have more confidence of what really went on in those cases.
Yeah.
And so I could imagine it's like you're charged, like you're going to err on the side of caution when you're like, there's this huge unknown and there's no resolution and these major allegations. And not only just that, it's like, what else? If these 3 came forward publicly to make this claim, like maybe there's a dozen people like that weren't willing to go forward.
Right.
Like you just don't know. And it sort of raises this specter of.
And I think that's exactly it. Like when you have this big question mark and you're putting your say, and I think that was the thing for a lot of the, again, my perspective is different than, when there's biostatisticians on there and there's like people that are all the numbers and they do trials and they do all that. Like they probably had a very different take on if they were sitting here, they'd probably have a different, maybe they would be purely numbers and doing it that way, right? But for me, when there was just even talking about like, oh, who got selected to move into the lung? Is that really, were they being biased in the who moved forward? Did this idea of the functional blinding, did that actually, did that make the results higher than they would have been if there wasn't? Like, I think there were just so many questions that in some ways, I actually thought that the FDA would have said, we're going to, and I don't know that Lykos would have liked it at the time, but maybe given what happened, to say, we're going to give it 6 months pause. We're going to go and we're going to investigate. I also, I wondered if the deadline of August 11th really drove a premature, even advisory board.
Yes.
Committee, because I don't feel like I had enough information to confidently, say, we never really do, but at least you have some kind of information. But I didn't feel like there was too many big question marks, like like the idea of, the allegations, like, well, we haven't investigated. Well, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? There's too many of those kind of things that maybe it was done, maybe they should have said, okay, here's a case, Lykos, I'm sorry. I know you want to get on the market. It's, August 11th is our deadline from our PDUFA paperwork that we did, but we need another, 6 months. Like, would that have been a better potential outcome to come to the committee with a little bit more, like you said, maybe ask for different data. They could have sliced it differently. Like, take those out, investigate, like, oh, what did you mean by there were biases? Like, who were the people that were the investigator? Just some of those general questions that might have not left such a big question mark in the committee's mind. And it would be great to know why the FDA issued the type of letter that they did. I would be really curious to have been a fly on the wall to know why, because it wasn't like they're like, you have to do a whole new blind phase 3 trial. Like, so they must have had some reason to say, we want you to do an entire new phase 3 trial. So that to me says something about they weren't confident with the, maybe it was the allegations, I don't know. Maybe it was about the biases that were in there. There was some reason that they wanted a whole new phase 3 trial.
Right. Like, no amount of slicing the data was apparently going to satisfy the FDA, which might fit. And I'm kind of now putting myself in the mindset of the folks in charge of Lykos, like the news as of, what was it, yesterday or today, saying they've laid, like, Rick Doblin's no longer involved, and they've laid off 75% of their staff. Yeah. Like, it sounds like they're clearing house, maybe in a very risk-averse way. Is like, we're getting rid of, and this is completely speculative to be clear, but like, we're getting rid of perhaps anyone without like firm roots in, other previous pharma work who's like, because it started out, I knew folks 20 years ago that started out as volunteers for MAPS and work. The original folks were people that volunteered at DanceSafe doing pill testing at raves and stuff like these. And they made basically next to no money to work for this organization they really believed in their heart for. Like, so I think like maybe the move is to like move on from that and sort of just really, really focus on the folks that like, no, we got to treat this like, like Merck and Pfizer and Eli Lilly and like the rest, like just get rid of all the advocates. Yeah. And I don't know. It's all speculative, to be clear. And, but it is, and that really is in some sense, it's a shame because it's like, I've known a lot of those people and their hearts have been really in the right place. But I also get the other perspective of like, oh, like maybe it's that advocacy that's caused this entire shadow of doubt. And, if they do go back and spend the millions for the phase 3, they want just to be squeaky clean.
Yeah, I was going to say there's something in the fact that, again, the kind of letter that it was with the rejection, and it said, we need a full, like, you need to do another phase 3 trial. So that says to me that somehow they weren't necessarily competent with that data, or there was enough shadow of something in the current set. So then it goes back to what you originally asked, Rob, of is this, you know, like, we have all these people that are out there that need a treatment. Like, then if that was what that numbers were based on, but now the FDA is not necessarily saying it was, maybe we don't know what we don't know, but there must be something in the fact that they're asking for a full another phase 3 trial, in my mind.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this stuff I would have thought a lot is potentially addressable by data nominally. It may be that just like if your entire confidence of the data set of the entire organization, like, we just don't trust any of this, then you might come to that conclusion, like, no, just start over, which is it's really humbling.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about safety here, which is very important. We should get into efficacy. There's a couple of things, and I get the sense that this is where the strongest disagreement would be between what I've heard from Kim in an email to us privately. We were I had Kim voice her concerns, and then I shared it with Matt. Matt and I talked about a few things when it comes to the functional blinding, and when it comes to the 40% of individuals in the studies having had prior MDMA use. Matt had a bit of a different perspective on that. Kim's already iterated a couple of times on the functional blinding issue. Matt, you have a different perspective on that. Can you voice your particular perspective on that in light of multiple panel members bringing up the fact that individuals would know whether they're getting MDMA or placebo, and that could potentially bias them in the direction of, getting the sense that this is the treatment that's going to work for them, and therefore that would facilitate it working in some way?
Yeah. The biggest concern here is that is our psychedelics being held to a higher standard than, dozens, if not hundreds of other psychoactive medications, particularly which are pretty pervasive in mental health care treatments. So, for example, probably the most recent example is Spravato, which is esketamine, a version of ketamine. That phase 3 research was based on a true placebo. And I haven't gone back to systematically assess the entire field. And Rav and I were talking about this a bit yesterday off of the podcast, but I think that's the case across the board. Just the litany of psychoactive medications, Adderall, which is amphetamine, and other amphetamine-like compounds for ADHD treatment, the benzodiazepines, which are the anti-anxiety medications, the Xanax, the Ativan, etc., Valium going back to the 60s, and the sleep drugs, which are close relatives to the benzos, the Zolpidem, which is Ambien, and all the other, Lunesta and all of the, those drugs, the opioid analgesics, just, prominent example. All of these drugs have prominent psychoactive effects. And somehow we have the impression that this breaking of the functional blind is a unique effect to psychedelics. And it is true that people will typically, not always, but typically say that psychedelics are more profound. People get more philosophical. They talk about the nature of reality and these types of things on psychedelics. But I would argue there's no evidence that they're more identifiable. Give someone 10 milligrams of amphetamine, Adderall, and that's going to be just as noticeable as, 20 milligrams of psilocybin or, 100 milligrams of MDMA. These are very, give someone, the standard dose of Ambien and have them, stay up for another 2 hours. It's going to be very noticeable. So this is just esketamine or Spravato. Again, I know that they, recently looked they used a true placebo in phase 3. Very clear, subjective experience with ketamine, including esketamine. So what I'm really concerned with is that the FDA had, and just I mean, I've seen this for decades. Scientists in general, we have both the lay public and scientists have this impression that this is a unique problem to psychedelics, but it's not unique. And the concern is that there's this higher standard. And so, and that there's no path forward. And my understanding is that Lykos maps, that the instructions they got from the FDA was like, look, we realize that tackling the blind is not going to be a completely solvable problem. Here's what the standard needs to be. You need to have randomization, and you need to have, for an indication like this, like PTSD, independent, blinded clinical assessors. I've done work with substance abuse treatment. We have a little bit of a advantage there that you can get biological verification. I can test urine to see whether they've been clean or not. But for someone like PTSD, the substitute for that is independent clinical, assessors who are blinded to condition. And that's an acceptable standard. And I would argue that scientifically, even though, high rates of individuals correctly guess the blind, there is nonetheless value in having a double blind, in the sense that, yes, people may have their guess, but you're not then, if the staff that are interacting with them are unaware of the of the true assignment, at least you're not causing that kind of the feedback, to use an electronics analogy, of amplifying that signal. So I would argue there's still some marginal value in maintaining blind conditions, even in situations. Even you'd obviously rather have a more successful blind, where it's chance rates of people guessing what they've received, whether it's the true drug or the placebo. There is some value in having a double-blind procedure and randomization with independent assessment. And so I thought that was the standard that the FDA was holding the field to. And I think, I thought that that's what the message that Lykos Maps had received, that's the standard that they're being held to. And so I know very well the blinding is not going to be perfect. I led my lab a systematic investigation. We published it a couple of years ago of all of the studies that have ever been published, controlled trials with psychedelics. And one of the biggest take homes is that most studies, including ones that I've done, and so mea culpa, in the past, you don't even assess the blind. You don't even ask the question. I mean, that's earlier phase research, not phase 3 research. But nonetheless, like, we need to do a better job as a field in assessing the blind, and I could tell you, I've gotten this influence from, early in my career, a senior colleague, very explicit, like, we don't want to ask that question because it's going to be ammunition used against us if we assess, including, not only like assessing the blind, but seeing if someone's used psychedelics again because we've introduced it to them. We don't want to ask that question. So we as a field need to go beyond that, and we need the truth, the good, the bad, the ugly. And so, we need to do a better job in assessing those data. But amongst the small subset, and I think it was like 14% of studies that had used a control condition that had actually assessed the credibility of the blind, that it was in the upper 90s of, people correctly guessing, as you would surmise, that they correctly guessed whether they got the drug or placebo, or even when you use an active placebo, we use dextromethorphan, which is a ketamine relative, and as a comparator to psilocybin, and some of the early work that I did with colleagues. And even there, it was like in the 80%. So even with a strong general psychedelic type compound, like a ketamine relative compared to psilocybin, people still, in the very large majority of cases, correctly identified. Now, so this is a pervasive problem, and I don't know whether it's something we're ever going to solve. I think I've had the idea for years that probably oral THC would probably be the most credible blind. It's never been, when it comes time to doing especially these upper phase trials, you don't want to take a chance with something new. I wish there was some public funding to test this question. Will something like that serve as a more credible active placebo? But, where we are right now, like, there's no perfect solution. And I've been going on a while, but the other point I would make is that in terms of the trajectory of my career and me looking at psilocybin for tobacco smoking cessation, people quitting smoking, a trial that I recently wrapped up and about to submit for publication is a large randomized trial of psilocybin versus nicotine patch. That was an open label randomized comparative efficacy study. And I know that the FDA doesn't require, they need double blind studies, and there's no perfect study. There's always pluses or minuses with any particular design. But the field of psychotherapy research is filled with hundreds and hundreds of studies over the decades with some really mountains of science that has resulted in many successful therapies for things like prolonged exposure and cognitive processing for PTSD and systematic desensitization for phobias and other anxieties, and, cognitive behavioral therapy for all kinds of things, depression, and, dialectic behavior therapy for borderline personality, on and on. I can go on and on and on. All of that is based, none of that is based on blinded research where it's not possible to blind your psychotherapy. All of that is based on a randomized comparative. We randomize people willing to do either the new shiny thing or a known standard, and then we assess outcomes. We get people randomized to one of the two things, and we objectively as we can assess outcomes long term. And so, I think in some sense, even if you have a randomized trial that uses a placebo, and you did have randomization and you did have independent assessment, that's similar to that standard that's been in place for psychotherapy research for many decades and has resulted in mountains of knowledge, a very solid science, I would argue, where blinding simply isn't possible. And so I kind of hate to see this, both the issue of the higher standard where, I guarantee you, on all these ADHD drugs and anxiety medications and sleep drugs and opioid analgesics, there's been functional breaking through the blind, I suspect in most cases it's not measured. The FDA hasn't asked for it. The average scientist doesn't even realize how discriminable something like a modest dose of amphetamine or a sleeping agent is. But as a behavioral pharmacologist, I'm, very well aware of this. And so I'm concerned about the higher standard. And then I'm also concerned that, that the value in having a randomized study and the analogy of psychotherapy, it's like as if we would throw out that entire, we know nothing about the efficacy of CBT because there wasn't any blinding there. So those are my kind of concerns and what's the path forward? And so that's why I would hope that the FDA would have provided some guidance to the advisory panel and say, look, we know this is not a solvable problem, so here's our standard that we will be satisfied with. I mean, it's almost like the judge telling the jury, hey, this is the standard, this is what the law is. You can't weigh this, but you weigh this. You make the judgment, but this is what we're counting legally, and this is what we're not. I would have hoped for something like that. So I'll stop there. Those are my thoughts. It's a complex topic that I've been thinking decades about because it's one of the burning questions in the field.
Yeah, I think, it was great to hear from somebody who's in this field, because that idea, I think it's going to always be an issue, right? The inert placebo. And so then it goes back to, if you are guessing, you're 90% guessed, and you're in this environment that's super hyped up environment, that, then it goes back to the quality of the evidence from the initial, for the efficacy, is that what ultimately drove, if we're in an environment where there's a lot of pressure, and even if you wanted to say something, or even if you weren't sure, you're going to be more pro. So I think that is right, where, when I think about this in context of that efficacy set of data, how did something like this, the functional blinding, add to it, or in that kind of hyped environment? And it sounds like that functional blinding is something that you're always thinking about. And you brought up one of my other things that the FDA does not do, which I think as a consumer people, we would love to see comparative, right? Comparatives, I think, are actually what people Like, how does it exist? How does it compare to what's already on the market, right? They don't want to do that. Companies don't want to
Which
do
I can tell you the EU, like the EMA and they're way more, that's what they're interested in.
Yeah, no, totally.
Because I helped lead a regulatory workshop where there are people from the EU and Germany and Australia, and like they were all in the same page. We're not going to solve the blind issue.
Yeah,
and maybe it's because they're also the payers in those countries, not just so their money is, and so that becomes more of an issue. It's like, we're paying for this. Like, we really want to make sure not only are we approving it, but we're going to, our money is on the line.
100%. I was going to say, that is one of our like complaints that we've had for a long time. It's like, why can't we do comparative like they do in the EU and EMA? They all use it, but it's because they pay for it. And so they want to make sure that the product does work better than what's already on the market. And if it doesn't, then but I do go back to the functional blinding, and maybe they are being held to a higher standard. Even like with any of the psychiatric drugs, like if obviously at some point the FDA did talk about wanting something, and somehow they walked away from that either low dose MDMA or niacin. Somewhere they walked away from their original request. And so I don't know where that came from and why they walked away. I don't know if that was the company that helped explain like why it wouldn't matter or whatnot. But I do wonder if that's going to be, again, it goes back to, if 40% already know what it's like and you're in this super advocate, hyper environment that's been driven for years of wanting to get it on the market, did all of that play into the results, or potentially could bias the results that, if we were to do it all over, I wonder if you were to ask Lykos, what would they do differently? I'd be curious, like if they were to now know all of this, because they probably have the reasons why. It'd be interesting how do you, but I do think that that functional blinding for future companies is going to be something that at least at the advisory board members level, they will probably bring up again.
Right. And I can tell you brought up something like the low dose MDMA or low dose for whatever other compound. That's a real tough one. And, the field has been grappling that with for years, and MAPS, their history in the earlier phase 2 research, were humbled. Their best guesses of what would be the efficacious dose were wrong. It was a much lower dose. So you get into and I've seen this with psilocybin, like some people only 10 milligrams, which is a third of like a high dose. That's enough gas in the tank for them to have like a really meaningful experience. And for other people, it's essentially nothing. So at these intermediate doses, you're going to strongly reduce your efficacy signal such that you now, instead of, needing for like a phase 3 study, like, 100, 200 people, now you need 800 people because you're getting real efficacy with your comparator. And so with that effect size is going to be smaller, and now you have less statistical power. And so that's and then you just don't have the money because it's like, now you're talking about whatever, 100 million instead of 20 million, whatever. Like it's, so that's the real concern there. It's hard to find that sweet spot. There really is no sweet spot. And like, say, if you get low enough, like the Compass, it wasn't phase 3, but like they're the biggest psilocybin study in the field. They used 1 versus 10 versus 25 milligrams psilocybin. 1 is absolutely trivial. Like that might as well be a placebo. So it's like, it almost like it can fool, like, oh, look, we technically used an active comparator, but like you didn't. And the same thing with niacin. And I say that like I'm running a trial now with niacin as the comparator for psilocybin. And frankly, this is under a NIDA grant, the Drug Abuse Institute. And the rationale there was like, that's what the FDA said. It's either they were interested in either true placebo or something like niacin. And so we went with niacin because that stood a better chance of getting past the NIH reviewers to get the grant. But I knew the whole time, including from my colleague Charlie Grobe, who used niacin as a comparator for the psilocybin cancer work that he published in 2011, that he said, niacin might even be worse than a true placebo, because 5 minutes on Wikipedia and I've got this like really strong flushing skin response that's only lasting a fraction of the time of psilocybin, and it's like that's kind of worse than having nothing in terms of identifying. This is like a clear signature that it's not psilocybin or MDMA. So again, it's such a headache.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think oral THC is probably a good thing. Hasn't been done yet, but
I think you should.
But who knows? That might not even. And the other concern is that, and a bit of a theoretical concern with oral THC, is that the other risk is if it's too much like the active compound, it might have efficacy itself. I mean, this is like a moderate dose of the drug itself, but like if you were to use, for example, dextromethorphan, which is like, it's in cough syrup, it's the ketamine relative that someone trips on, it's very psychedelic. It's in the ketamine category of anesthetic psychedelic or dissociative psychedelic. I did some, as I mentioned, comparative work with dextromethorphan and psilocybin. It wasn't for depression. It was in healthy normals. But if I was to use that as an active comparator in a depression study or PTSD study, my concern would be that really worked. I mean, we know ketamine works for depression, and maybe one of the reasons why ketamine is working is because it is in this broader class of psychedelics. And so the perfect active placebo may have equivalent or at least half the efficacy, or 75% of the efficacy of the compound of interest, in which case then you, again, the situation like, now you need 2,000 people in the study to tease out this subtle difference between these two things. So it really is just such a mind-blowing headache. It's a tough problem.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal, mental, and physical health, and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed, generalized kind of medical advice, and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it. And there's more problems too, even like with serious adverse events. There's also the problem of some individuals when taking a low dose of psychedelics, like a low dose of MDMA, for some people in theory could put them in this state of certain, issues are coming up, certain traumas are coming up, but they're not at high enough of a dose to fully face that with this kind of fearlessness, with this sense of safety and security. And so it's like potentially you're triggering something, and theoretically that could lead to suicidal ideation or depression or anxiety or panic because these issues are coming up, but you're not at a high enough of an MDMA dose to actually be able to safely work through that. And so then with that, the serious adverse events, if you had some level of adverse events from people with PTSD, given these like small flare-ups of their PTSD with a low dose MDMA or whatever other drug, then you're like, is that really an apples to oranges comparison?
Yeah. And MAPS had some data suggestive of that in their exploratory work, that the way Rick Doblin put it, like a low dose may be anti-therapeutic. And we don't know exactly about the data why, but it may be for the rationale that you're saying. It puts them in this in-between world, which actually makes them worse theoretically. It is tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Thanks for.
Yeah, and so the bigger concern I hope the FDA is focused on is like, okay, there might be real, and I'm convinced there is, real efficacy for these things. And there's a lot of potential to help people if we do it right. We have to have a realistic path forward because this is kind of baked in. It's like, I think the evidence suggests we need more research, but that the experience itself is why it's working, particularly long-term. And so you're never gonna, if you did it under anesthesia, it's like likely not to work. Like there's going to be no way perhaps that you could ever successfully blind this. Like if you perfectly mimicked something that has psychedelic experience, it in itself could have the efficacy. So we have to have some standard by which we could potentially approve these things. And it might take like the FDA loosening up. I don't know. I'm not holding my breath, but accepting comparative efficacy data. We're randomizing, we're comparing it to whatever else, like for PTSD, like we're comparing it to a gold standard course of prolonged exposure therapy. And if this gets a lower dropout and higher success rates than that at the end of the day, because the other thing I'll say about the blinding is that we should thank God we have an FDA, because we don't want 100 years ago where you could just sell snake oil on the side of like literal snake oil, so any garbage to, cancer patients and whatever. And they're spending all of their money on stuff that does absolutely nothing. And so one of the questions is there in kind of NIH scientific speak, is there target engagement? Is there actually any biological activity that is theoretically linked to the outcome? And even though there's a lot to figure out about the long-term, what's mediating biologically those long-term decreases in depression or PTSD, we know a lot about acutely what the psychedelics are doing in the brain. A lot of dramatic things are happening. That's not a placebo effect. We know a lot about very real, very dramatic biological cascades of changes that are mediating this change in subjective experience. In fact, I would say we know a lot more about the acute response to psychedelics than we do about SSRIs after all of these decades. And so that does address to me some, because of a knowledge of the biological activity, that does address at least part of the issue about the placebo. Is it all driven by placebo effect? We know that it's not all, at least the acute effects are not driven by placebo entirely. I mean, there is a very real biological effect. And I would say with MDMA, there's at least the way that it works theoretically, it makes a really compelling story that there's this dampened amygdala response, which is exactly the idea that people can re-experience they can contemplate their traumatic experience in a way where they have such a dramatic viewpoint of it that becomes reconsolidated. It's completely in line with our modern neuroscientific and psychological understanding of how memory works, with the reconsolidation of memories, that and the biological signature of what MDMA does. That, I mean, I put that all in the same kind of bucket. To there's no perfect solution, but the different aspects of the science tell me that this is a really credible story, that this is not, I mean, there's always a placebo response. And in medicine in real life, you would hope there's real efficacy plus as much placebo response as you could get, because that does lead to real efficacy in the real world. But to me, it's very convincing that this is not entirely driven by placebo. Like, there is real direct efficacy, but just drawing from those different areas of science. So, which is why I hope there's a path forward so that this blinding issue doesn't just like hamper the field. And it depends on like what's the FDA, what's their standard, and what do we need to do to meet it.
Have you guys?
Yeah. So Kim, I was just going to say, just to close the loop on this particular chapter of the conversation. I'm curious, are you fairly convinced, somewhat convinced, or not convinced on the story of MDMA in itself facilitating these powerful experiences to work through trauma? And B, are you now kind of understanding these concerns about, it seems like FDA has double standards, or this impossible standard in the case of psychedelics, where this functional blinding problem seems just incredibly difficult to solve, and yet it's not applied to other drugs like Adderall and Ritalin, things that we're handing out like Halloween candy to kids who are struggling with attention or for sleep disorders or depression, etc. I think those are some pretty big concerns. Are you kind of changing your mind on that, or kind of seeing why individuals were concerned that concern was particularly raised when it's a very difficult problem to solve?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I can say this. I do believe that there is, like what you just said, it's not the placebo effect. I mean, yes, and we know that a lot of psych drugs have, like any drug, when you're taking a placebo, oh, I'm getting better. But I do believe that there is the potential with these medications, right? Or with, MDMA or psilocybin. So I do think that there's a lot of things that the FDA still needs to kind of work through. And I don't know if it's something that, as the companies get together and have meetings with the FDA, and if it's the advocates, all the researchers, the companies, like it almost seems like there needs to be, and I don't know, maybe they've already done this. Have you had big meetings where it's been this, like, not a competition amongst researchers, but really coming together as the field with the FDA to have these kind of discussions, because I think
there has a little bit, like I presented at an early workshop by the FDA where they're asking some of these questions, but I don't think there's been any resolution, because they're, as you know, like they're so complex, and so there's been at least some attempt there, but
because I feel like there is, these are going to be continued. Like you raised, obviously, Matt, a lot of good points, and even understanding the whole issue with functional. But it might be, so when I said earlier about like the FDA having to maybe change things, like, is this an opportunity to do the comparative? Like, I know they don't want to do the comparative, but is this a way for this, particular field to like do the comparative against something else? So you can actually see and have data. I don't know. It seems like that could be a potential use for, and a rationale for using comparative.
Right. And that would be a great outcome that would benefit, I think, really all of medicine, frankly, because I think we do need to shake things up. I mean, there's a lot of power, and again, I don't want to trash any design, but every type of study design has its pluses and minuses. There's no perfect type of study. You have to take different types of studies and weigh their pluses and minuses. And the real answer comes from a real human being triangulating across all of that, the different ways of asking these questions and taking into account the pluses and minuses. And just, the double blind study is just, has its own limits. And I think I would say more so with psychedelics, because I've been in dozens of sessions where it's a placebo. And I can tell you what, unlike, say, you're studying a new antifungal or even like an SSRI, like we're modeling something that's very bizarre when we do placebo-controlled trials, but that's not going to happen. Like when you do actual treatment with psychedelics, and we say we're going to give you 30 milligrams of psilocybin, it's not, if you feel an effect. It's like you're going to feel, 1 out of 100 or less, or like not going to be sensitive to like what's considered a high dose. So something's going to happen, but when you give a placebo, it's just really weird because we warned them, like, this could be really scary. Like, you might think you're dying. You might think you're going crazy. And this might be the most intense experience you've ever had. You give them all this warning, and then, they're laying on the couch, and then an hour later, I don't think it's doing anything. I don't think it's doing anything. And then you're wondering whether it's going to be the most boring day of your life, or if you're going to have this like life altering, good or bad, whatever, like dramatic experience. So that's not going to happen in the real world. And so we've introduced this thing. Again, that's not happening when you put someone on placebo for an SSRI or placebo for an antifungal or whatever, just random examples across medicine. So I'd want to convey that to the FDA and science in general, that like, it's not to say that double-blind studies shouldn't be done, but it's just one type of study design. But we really need other types of study designs to complement that, to address the weaknesses of the double-blind design, particularly with psychedelics, where the evidence is pointing to the fact that the dramatic subjective effects is not incidental. It is the reason why it's working.
Yeah.
Again, we need more research on that, but that's where my bets are at, and that's where I think the evidence is strongly leaning.
Yeah. Not to go down this rabbit hole, but there are these scientists, and there's like articles like scientists think that you could do psychedelics without the psychedelic experience, and that just that seems so absurd to me.
But that's very credible, though. But the treatment model would be different. So it may be that you can harness the neuroplasticity, which has been shown in rodents, but you're not going to get, my strong bets are like, you're not going to administer 1, 2, or 3 times, which is the typical for the various MDMA or psilocybin studies. You're not going to administer it 1, 2, or 3 times and then see benefit 6 weeks, 6 months, a year later, like you're often seeing in these trials. Like, for that, I think you need the experience. But it may be that it might be similar to psychedelic microdosing, which is, there's not a whole lot of science on, but if there is a reality there, it might be like the development of these non-psychedelic analogs that's having some more subtle effect, but it's going to require taking this every day like an SSRI or something like that.
Which would be very different.
It's going to be very different. So I'm a big advocate, all of the above. We need as much help as we can in mental health.
Yeah.
Let the flowers grow, let the natural selection, let the scientists with that interest explore that and see what I mean. I think the bigger bet is I'm placing my bets on the high dose psychedelic work, but I'm really glad that some great colleagues are exploring those other avenues, because it may be that both work, but I think it would be a different type of treatment model.
Yeah, it would just be totally different. It would be absent the mysticism, the subjective religious experiences, the sense of awe, sense of transcendence.
Right. And more like a typical not to say that we can't use another option, but more like an SSRI. You take it every day. It has some subtle effect that is tweaking the serotonin. I mean, there's a plausible reason that it could have an effect, but again, it wouldn't be this kind of one experience that then changes your. I mean, it seems very clear that the way that this high dose MDMA or psilocybin research is being done, it's essentially, whether it's nominal psychotherapy or not, it is functional psychotherapy. Because when you talk to people, they say, this is what happened to me. This is how I saw myself differently. This is how I'm in the habit of thinking about myself differently, thinking about these issues that I used to really suffer from. This is how I think about them differently. And when I have these thoughts, this is my response to them that's different than it used to be. I mean, it's like a life experience or psychotherapy has changed you. So that's why I think it's just very credible that it's like, it is the experience. But yeah.
One more point about the functional blinding, which is just that, like the what occurs to me, that the power of belief is really hard to kind of eliminate. Like, and there was recent studies I was hearing about on Huberman's podcast. Dr. Lane Norton was on talking all about fitness and nutrition, and he was citing these studies on creatine. Creatine is a supplement people use for working out, which has shown benefits for like even increasing reps, increasing endurance, muscular power, etc.
And some cognitive effects too, incidentally.
Some cognitive effects I've heard of as well. And studies where they tell individuals that this is creatine, but it's not. The power, like the belief of that they're taking creatine, leads to more reps in the gym, greater performance. And so with this MDMA, like that belief, it's difficult to fully tease that out. And when you and also the level of efficacy that we saw, in the 60% range in phase 2, I think, and in phase 3 in the 70% range, that is very high level of efficacy. If we're talking particularly about this, if we're talking about, say, Matt, with your smoking cessation research, I believe 84%, like those are very, very high figures, right?
80%, yeah.
Yeah. But just to look at the MDMA figures, though, like 70+% efficacy rate, a high number of individuals going into remission, significant number of individuals who had drastic improvement. That it doesn't occur to me that it's plausible that would just be a placebo effect, or even a strong part of it would be placebo, given that we're seeing such high levels of efficacy in the studies.
Right. Although I could imagine, playing the devil's advocate, some of it's going to be placebo effect. Again, there's always placebo effect. And in the real world practice of medicine, you want as much placebo effect as possible, ideally on top of some direct efficacy, because you just want to get better. So like some of that with any of these results is going to be placebo effect. What you just really want to know is that it's not all placebo effect. And you want to know that there's something substantial beyond just, placebo effect. And so, but I could imagine though, if you suspect like, well, maybe there's some efficacy, but it's like really, and again, to play the devil's advocate, it may be that, it's mostly placebo effect. And really the efficacy is more like Zoloft for PTSD. I mean, I don't think that to be the case, but I could imagine that someone could come to that conclusion. That's in the cloud of uncertainty that, okay, like maybe there's something here, but we don't quite trust the numbers that high given the number of, but I guess I'm playing more of Kim's role here. So maybe I should let you address it.
No, I like it. I like hearing, but I also, then when I'm listening to you, I go, then why aren't we doing comparatives? Like,
right.
I mean, that's where I come back to. And because imagine then you could do that. Okay. You compare it up against Zoloft, you can do it placebo, you do it against MDMA, you have all of it, and now you have something to compare it really against, other than, I mean, I know that's not what they're going to do. It's not the double-blinded, placebo-controlled, which has always been the gold standard, and I sound like a broken record because I've said those words so many times. But maybe this is a chance to do, think about it differently. Is for, in this kind of this is a new field. It may not feel new to people who've been in this field, but I think for a lot of people, including, the mainstream, the doctors, psychiatrists, like those, there's a lot of people, this is a new field that we're treading on, right? And so it might need to be thought about differently and not in the traditional way, because it's not necessarily a traditional, Zoloft versus, it's a totally different kind of, mechanism. So, right. That might be an opportunity to do something differently,
yeah, that would be, and I would say like evidence, comparative efficacy combined with some earlier stage evidence that it's not pure, like it does engage some target activity in the CNS that's plausible, that could lead to the long-term like results. Because again, because that adds to the overall evidence that it's not purely placebo. Like it's really doing something in the brain. Right. We know it's an agonist. It releases serotonin, as in the case of the MDMA. Causes dramatic changes in brain network activity, the brain communication patterns, change in the amygdala response, like that combined with some solid comparative efficacy data. Makes for, to me, I would take those two over a double-blind trial. I think that's a stronger case of evidence. But like add all of it, get the double-blind plus the other two. Yeah. And if they're all telling you the same story, then
right, that's where then you go, okay,
ideal.
There's something here. Right.
There was the issue of selection bias. I think that's kind of the last major. There's a few other things too, but that's kind of the last major thing, which Kim, you brought up in our private exchange. About the fact that 40% of individuals in the study had prior use of MDMA. So there was this concern that they're biased towards it. I guess maybe just to accelerate this, maybe Matt, do you want to respond to that? I mean, many people have heard that concern, and then we'll let Kim respond to that, to your response for that particular issue, because there's a very important point to make in response to that.
Right, and the data were presented at the meeting, pretty briefly, but I took note. I took a screenshot and was, here are those 40% who had MDMA before, and here's the other 60% who hadn't had it, and the efficacy rates, in other words, the reductions in PTSD were like identical. In fact, I think they were within. The error bars swamped any difference. But I think even numerically, it looked a tiny bit even better in the people that didn't. Not that that's a meaningful difference, but better in the people that hadn't used MDMA. So it just didn't seem like, clearly by those data, it seemed to me that it wasn't credible that one's experience with MDMA led to an increased, inflated efficacy. Now, it's a little bit more of a difficult question. I'd say there's more of a question on the safety. It's like, okay, do you get a degraded safety signal because maybe the people who had negative experiences in their own use of MDMA were less likely to participate in the trial, and therefore you're getting less chance to assess people prone to negative, adverse events. I still don't think that's very credible because we do have the 60% that hadn't used it. And frankly, a lot of things that would be identified as an AE, like increased blood pressure, like in a clinical trial, like are just not even going to be recognized as anything negative in, taking it at a rave, where someone is overheated and their heart's racing anyway, and they're not being medically monitored. And I don't know if the data were presented on this, but my presumption is that probably all of those 40% that had used MDMA had not used it in the treatment of PTSD. They had taken it, whatever, like in college, went out dancing, their buddies scored it, they tried it, went out on a Saturday night, like whatever, the typical thing. So
sounds pretty fun.
Right. And so that's just a different situation. So to me, it didn't seem credible that, and probably you are going to, 40% is higher than the number of people, the percentage of the population who had used MDMA, which I know the psilocybin number, but it's going to be something like, 10, something around 10% that like lifetime use of MDMA. So, it's certainly higher than that, but you are going to get a higher, in terms of people willing to do this treatment, if it's approved clinically, probably a safe assumption, like you are going to get a higher percentage of people who have tried on their own. So to me, I didn't see that as damning at all. I thought like, yeah, we have 60% that didn't, and the efficacy looked, identical. So to me, I kind of weight that as zero. So yeah, I'd be curious on Kim's thoughts, of course.
So I think for me, I wasn't looking necessarily like 40, 60, for efficacy results. I was talking more about the idea of the bias in a hyped environment. Like the fact that you're getting it because that was part of it with the blinding. Like, oh, I know I've had it, so I know that there's going to be a more function. Like I can identify that I've taken this drug. So I think that's really, for me, it wasn't so much the results between, it was more what kind of bias did that create, because we are already in this super hyped up pro environment. Did you have more pro people because of having 40% with prior use? It's just like, what did that do to potentially inflate results?
Right. And to play the devil's advocate, even the 60% that hadn't used it might still be the type of person that's especially excited about this treatment. So just the fact that 40% had, like, is one indication that they were really, really excited about this therapy, which could add to that. So that's a good point. Although I would say on the other side, like, how are you ever going to get around that? Because you can't. Yeah. It's not ethical to randomly select people from the population. You have to get volunteers. And so I'm also concerned about the impossible standards.
But then I go to when you just said, like, you're going to have to get volunteers. Who are these volunteers? Where did they come from? Like, you're already in this, I think this is what there were so many questions about. And I wonder if ultimately this is what impacted and why the FDA is asking for a new phase 3. Like, if you're in this environment, you're like, hey, we're going to bring all you people together. We want it, your investigators are going to be super pro hype. You got, everybody wants something different. Like, does that artificially inflate numbers with the selection bias? And then when I say the 40%, that just says that there is a pro, and of course, when you're looking for something and you've been on, so you can see the other side too, right? Like, you've been suffering with something and you're like, I just want something to work. So I'm going to be like, so you're going to be more apt to try it too. So you can see it both ways. But I just think at the end of the day, there's just, there were so many questions that ultimately, you couldn't just give it a flat yes, a confident yes.
Two kind of smaller, or you could say more general points. Well, actually, one of them is a very small point. Which I really don't want to spend more time on this than is necessary. But Matt, you and I were chatting on the phone. A couple of panel members saying that the study lacked racial diversity. Like,
that's another thing. Their second study, I forget what the numbers were, but they even at the abstract level in the publication, like, bragged about, because it was really impressive how much of diversity they did have. Yeah. And so overall, it was what? Does someone remember the numbers? It was like,
I think it was 50 to 60% was non-white.
Right.
I think it was 60%. Yeah.
That's better than the population. Yeah, that's a more higher representation of minorities in the U.S. Canadian population. So what? But it's also, I'm concerned about those types of criticism.
It was 40 to, it might have been 40%, in which case it's on level. So from what I remember, it was on par with the population.
When you look at, I was just going through the demographics. I didn't bring that up, but I will say this, that this tends to be an issue. And I'm not saying because I wasn't the one that brought it up. But the idea of lack of diversity in clinical trials is a huge problem with drug trials in general at the FDA. Like, a lot of times you'll see, hey, they're like, it's supposed to be for elderly, and there's like nobody's old in the trial, right? Everybody's 50 and under. So like, I don't know that, but I'm just looking here, and it was kind of like either ethnicity being Hispanic or Latino, not non-Hispanic or Latino. And so that, I think because if I remember correctly, and I don't remember, maybe it was like was there a public member who was like a vet and talked about the lack of African American? I feel like it was African American ethnicity, if I remember correctly. But anyways, I don't know. But yes, I'm not surprised that people brought that up, because that tends to be something that people notice in clinical trials.
Right, and I probably should have this.
I found the stat. It was over 50% of participants in the 3 trials identified as non-white.
And then, what's the percentage of Black participants?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Kim the FDA, though, it's interesting in all the data. It does not. It just says not a non-Hispanic or Latino or Hispanic or Latino. It does not have. It's very interesting. It doesn't list. And
I've got data here from one of the published phase, and I know there were 2, but I pulled up one just quickly of the face of the peer-reviewed publication, and it's MDMA therapy had 0 Black African American, and then the placebo group had 2 people. Oh yeah, and this is out of a group size of 44 to 46.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right.
And so they had 2 people out, so that is low.
They had 2.
Yeah,
but that's just one of the 2 studies. But yeah, that is like, so that's 2 out of 90 people, which is what I think. Black Americans are
about 12%.
Around, I was going to say 11, so something like that, 11, 12%. So that's below that. So I would also say though that in considering, it's important to consider those differences, but there's areas of medicine where it's biologically more of a, you do have disorders like sickle cell anemia and, skin cancer, which, with the difference in melanin, and it's like you have different rates of disease states and different, some, real biological differences, which may impact a certain racial ethnic group more than the other. I would say, stepping back, there's no plot. I mean, MDMA is a serotonin releaser. There's no, you got to always be careful in science. We don't know what we don't know, but out of everything that's known, I don't know of any plausible biological mechanism for the effects of MDMA to differ by race.
Yeah.
It's not like, you see what I'm saying?
Totally. I think that I'm just going to say, I do think that is just a general comment that a lot of people who are on, and I don't know that I would say that was even something specific to this per se. Maybe whoever said it looked at it in this context, but that is an issue that tends to get brought up at all, because it's also, I am looking at it, 84, in MAPS 1, 39 of the 46 on MDMA were white. So 84.8%.
In which study?
I'm looking
which
at
one is that?
That's MAPS 1. So 84% of the MDMA group was white.
In the phase 1 study.
N of 46, 39 were white. And
no, I don't think she's saying phase 1. I think she's saying the first phase 3 study.
There's
right.
MAPS 1 and MAPS 2 were the two phase 3 trials.
And so I've now pulled up the second. I mean, they're both Mitchell et al. Papers, but I've brought up the second, and I don't know which one is coded as MAPS 1 versus MAPS 2, but I gave you the numbers for the other one that was 2 out of 90. But in this one, the number of Black/African American is 5 out of 53 for MDMA and 3 out of 51 for placebo. So a little better.
Better. Yep, that's exactly.
So 8 out of 104, which is close, a little bit below, but it's close to the population level of African Americans in the U.S.
I don't know if either of you know, but I'm not sure why this is a concern. If it's a biological issue, Matt, you've already talked about that. That doesn't make any sense. If this is part of a broader social justice point, I mean, if you're just screening people, you have hey, we have an MDMA study. Who's volunteering for that? You're never going to get perfectly equal outcomes across all racial groups. How many Vietnamese people, how many South Asian, does that really?
You can go on and on.
That doesn't really matter. I hope. In either way, it doesn't really make sense. If it's a biological thing, it doesn't make sense. If it's a more social justice thing,
I think
that's unfortunate.
I'm just going to say, I've been doing this advocacy work for a long time. This is a inherent issue with trials that go before the FDA, whether it's age, the right age mix. Even one of the drugs, it was for female sexuality. And it was men that were in the trial. It made no sense. I think this is an issue that people do look at from the outside. They look at what were the trial makeups. And granted, a lot of times it's hard to get people to enter in trials. I'm not saying this has anything to do with this particular one, but I do think those are issues that people do look at. The Parkinson's, we had one drug where it does largely impact the African-American community, and there were hardly any Black people in the trial. And so then that becomes an issue and the companies will have, and again, not this trial, the companies have recognized this, and they're actually trying to do a better job of recruiting more people in their clinical trials. So I'm guessing that might have been why somebody brought that question up. And I also wonder and I do remember, I think there was 1 or 2 people that were public speakers that actually do trials. And I think she was an African-American woman who was in the military who was leading trials or something. but she complained about the fact that there weren't a whole lot. But she's doing her own set of trials or something. I just remember that was one of the speakers that made that comment too. So maybe that's what triggered somebody to say it. I don't know.
And it's a major focus of NIH, and all of the academics are largely on that panel are going to have experience like I do of NIH funded research. And that's like you really have to address these issues. I mean, sex and race and ethnicity, to have as good of representation of a price. So it's not a surprise that it comes up, but then, I don't know what I'm not familiar with. This is the standard. Okay. Like this is the data set, and, hopefully they tried the best they could. And are we going to reject it because of this? And to me, again, kind of like that other issue with blinding, it's like you put together a different, in the absence of any even theoretical reason why you would expect different efficacy across racial groups for this particular treatment. In treatment of this disease, I wouldn't. Yeah.
I think people, you know what? I think on these, I'm going to say how many, like I have brought that issue up. I did not bring it on here, but I've noticed it for other drugs that I've done, like Parkinson's drugs and Parkinson's psychosis drug. I was like, well, where are the people that it's actually the population that it impacts? It doesn't become a reason why I didn't voted or didn't vote for something. It's just one of those points that people will bring up when they're discussing the drug or some of the trials, et cetera. So it could have been as simple as that. I don't know that.
Right.
I can't imagine that was a reason why somebody said no. But.
Right. And there is an important historical backdrop where, there was underrepresentation and, just different things, obviously, like Tuskegee, where it's like, horrible research was done specifically with minority populations, and then minorities not being represented in really important research. And then, just in animal research, God, it was just like pervasive for years. Like you never studied like female rats, and just like it was always just male rats. So these are, thankfully, there is a pervasive focus on is doing as best we can in research to make sure there's representation.
Yeah. So we've talked about functional blinding. We've talked about safety. We talked about the sexual assault issue, regulation of therapy, the 40% of study participants who had taken MDMA. We talked about hyper-round therapy. Before we get to the last topic broadly, which is just the current state of treatment for PTSD, which is important to hit on, is there anything else, Kim, that was of particular concern for you or in general from the panel?
No, I think you hit on a lot of them. I think it would be really interesting. I come from a very broad perspective as the consumer rep. I would be, it'd be interesting to hear what like the psychiatrists that are on the board, why they did, as well as I'd be curious why, like the statistician that's on our board, he just, from a stats place, you could just see his mind saying like, this doesn't even make sense. I can't remember. So I'm curious, like I'd be curious again. I always say like, it's not about stats for me because it's ultimately about the real world. And so, yes, stats are a part of it, but like there are so many other issues as somebody like in my role from the consumer where it's about what's coming down the road, like once it's in the real world. But so I'd be curious what if they were on here, what they would say.
Yeah, that actually might be a good idea for a podcast. Lastly, just the current state of treatments. I think both of you have something to say on a couple of different things on this front. In general, I'll just say I happen to know people with PTSD, both in family and friends. Very debilitating condition that harms both your waking life and your sleep life, from what I've heard from people. I have a good family friend from the Middle East, or sorry, not family friend, just a friend from the Middle East, an immigrant, and hearing her stories about PTSD, it's a very challenging condition to deal with. And so people are very much struggling to find treatment options. And as FDA knows, this was described in the advisory committee meeting, that dropout rates are very high with current PTSD treatments because, as one would intuitively suspect when you start a treatment for PTSD, like talk therapy or even SSRIs, or particularly with therapy, we're talking here, if you're talking about traumatic memories and excruciating moments in your life psychologically, it takes a lot of willpower. It takes a lot of strength to go there. And many people just have a hard time. I mean, even people who don't have PTSD, who've gone through difficult things in life, it's very hard to talk about them. So one would understand why there's such high dropout rate. And the utility of the MDMA, as I alluded to before, is that it allows individuals to go to those difficult pockets of their unconscious or subconscious where they've had these painful experiences, but to come from a place of safety and security rather than a place of paralyzing fear. But currently, there doesn't seem to be anything similar to that. Matt, maybe do you want to first talk a little bit about, as far as your understanding goes, on the current state of psychotherapeutic treatments? When we talked a bit about that over DMs, about EMDR, cognitive processing, CBT, etc. Do you generally share the concern that the high dropout rate, because people with PTSD, they're ridden with paralyzing fear. So to bring up, this thing that happened 20 years ago, this way you were abused, 2 years ago, talking about that, it's going to lead to a high rate of dropout, right? That's kind of the main
That's
concern.
It's one of the most common issues. Although, and I brushed up on the numbers of this, and it's somewhere between 25 and 40% typically, which is a high dropout rate. But that still means plenty of people do remain in treatment, and there's a pretty decent efficacy for the people, with a lot of studies showing the majority of people showing some benefit, and it's larger than you get with the SSRIs. So, I took objection to someone. There was a recent article with a headline, I think it was in Time, MDMA is, I'm going to get this wrong, so this is not a quote, but there's no good treatments for PTSD and MDMA might change that. But it's like, no, that's part of the hype. Like, there are some good treatments. Like, there's plenty of room for improvement, but it's not like there's not good I would say there's no good pharmacological treatments for PTSD. So that's going to depend on your definition of good. The effect size for the SSRIs seem pretty small. I don't want to say they may arguably trivial, but even a small effect can be beneficial to someone who's at risk of suicide. So I don't want to dismiss that. So again, I'm generally in favor for more tools in the toolbox than fewer. But there is a pretty decent effect size for prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and EMDR, and similar exposure-based treatments. So that's the commonality of these, and which is that these are what you would call exposure-based treatments. And across all of the anxiety disorders, and PTSD is one form of anxiety disorder, that's how it's classified in the DSM, which is the psychiatric Bible, so to speak. Exposure therapies have really impressive efficacy across a number of anxiety disorders, whether it's simple phobias, like you're afraid of bridges, where systematic desensitization is pretty darn effective, where first you get used to looking at pictures of bridges without, with having a relaxed response and habituating to the increased heart rate. And then you kind of take visits close to the bridge, but don't go over. And then eventually you go over the bridge as you work your way up. It's that same general rationale for this type of thing, for prolonged exposure and the similar therapies for PTSD. Like, we're going to create a safe environment for you to talk about this therapy and process it in a safer environment, and then use that opportunity a way to reconsolidate the way that you view this event, and from a calmer, more kind of dispassionate, less fight or flight mode, which I would argue is what's happening in MDMA therapy, more in the black box. It's sort of, I would say, enhanced exposure therapy. But so I do want to say that there are some decent treatments, psychotherapies, that the drugs are pretty there's some treatments that might help, but they're not as impressive as the psychotherapy. So prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, and EMDR are the big three that had the most evidence behind them. But like I said, there's room for improvement. And what MDMA looks like to me when done well is sort of like exposure therapy on rocket boosters. Because when you listen to people talk about what they went through in MDMA, it's exposure therapy. Like they are reprocessing their trauma with this pharmacological enhancement of this dampened, fight or flight response. And this like increased, sense of safety through the increased bonding with the therapists, and this kind of whole cocktail of physiological effects that are happening in the brain with MDMA, which really in multiple ways does seem like kind of the perfect, medication for this. If you want to create a calming environment where and rather being sort of inebriated, like with alcohol, where like, you're not cognitively dampened. You're able to fully process and think about and deeply consider these experiences while having this very different valence where it is seemingly decrease in self-judgment and a decrease in the propensity to just like freak out and say, no, I can't deal with that. And just, to the degree that you don't want to do it anymore, it seems to be making it worse in the short term, and you drop out of therapy. So they're talking about it and exploring it's like how it made them feel. And yeah. The more that the person can engage with it and, kind of emotionally put themselves back in that situation, and face the issue, just like, approaching the bridge. If you have a phobia for heights, it's that right level of like, okay, we're here in this safe environment in the therapist office where, it's not like the original situation, but we're going to, even though your normal instinct would be like, no, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to talk about this work. I'm going to encourage you. And for what I've learned from, therapists that specialize in PTSD is really part of the art of what they deal with, and they train people to do this therapy is like, people tend to want to come in with kids' gloves and they don't want to push too hard, but they're like, no. When you're training someone to do these therapies, what you typically have to do is like, no, you need to push them harder. Like you're not going to break them. You want to push, like, cause the path through is like directly in, like it's going to be difficult. You're going to have to talk about the scary stuff, but I'm here with you. It's going to be okay. But no, we're going to talk about the scary stuff. And so that's, yeah. And the more I think you can delve into that, and, the better it works, and obviously that takes like going to the next treatment session. Yeah. Because now every time you think you have a memory, it's not like we pull up a photo in our brain. Every time that you pull up a memory, you're actually manipulating it. Which is the source of the big fish story, where he told the story 100 times, and every time the size of the fish gets bigger. Like you're not lying. Like that's a real phenomenon where you have drift in your memories. And there's even been, research on so-called flashbulb memories, like where there's evidence, like where were you when the Challenger blew up or whatnot. And you actually have some historical records of where that person was at. And it's been shown that people they have some pretty remarkable drift in terms of like, I could swear I was in so-and-so's like, 6th grade class when that happened. And now I'm seeing evidence that wasn't quite the situation. But I got used to thinking about it that way. So this happened. That's not just traumatic memories. That's the way memory in general works. Is that it's all pliable. And when you have a memory of anything, a person, an event, that it's being manipulated. And typically the degree of manipulation is pretty minor. But the idea is with something like with MDMA, you're addressing that memory from such a profoundly different vantage point. And this is what's being shot for in therapy, but perhaps better done with that pharmacological enhancement of MDMA. That's such a change that has more sticking power. That's it's a more pliable memory. It's during that kind of like vulnerable, pliable state when you've retrieved that memory and you're processing it, you're not just doing a minor tweak, you're doing a pretty major tweak, because if the context is like, you don't have the self-judgment and you're like, let's say it's a sexual assault and you're like, oh my God, it's like, it really, really wasn't my fault. Like, and you would be able to like view yourself the way you would view another person. It's like, oh my God, like, look at how resilient you have been. And like, that was not your fault at all. And like some of these, like the guilt or, a vet. I mean, I remember one vet describing his MDMA treatment and just describing how like what set it off was like, he killed a little girl that was like, it was like, you're in this firefight. It's like, and then you just realize like, he didn't mean it, but like, that's what happens in war. And you're like, it's just like, he was just a monster. Like, he just like, I am a monster. I killed like a little girl. Like, and, and that this was such a profound experience of kind of viewing himself from this different vantage point. And the way I think about it is the way you would view someone else when they're telling you the story. It's like, dude, that wasn't your fault. Like, really, man, you did the best you could. And you were in this horrible situation. And, so it's like one views himself with that compassion, the pharmacologically enhanced and that very different vantage point. And that is it's such a different way of viewing it than they normally do, that the degree to which they change that memory is much more than when you normally conjure up a memory and pack it back away. Now, that's what you shoot for in these other therapies, but I would, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, but theoretically the hope is, and what I think is going on is like, that's happening in an even more enhanced way because of the pharmacology in MDMA treatment. Yeah, and all of the context and the thoughts and the feelings associated. It's like, they're not just like this pure memory. It's like, there's all these tentacles. This is all metaphor, obviously, but these tentacles of like, it's self-hatred and guilt and, this judgment and just feeling, thoughts of being like permanently damaged and like, and just panic, and like there's this whole cluster of thoughts and emotions that are surrounding this memory. And the idea is that if you could really have this profoundly different way of interacting with it, that's kind of stashed back away. And now the next time under normal conditions under which and again, this is at play for these other psychotherapies and MDMA, perhaps, I'd love to see research directly comparing the two. But the idea, it might be better with MDMA, but you're shooting for the same thing. You're shooting for like, now that I've kind of am now used to seeing it from this different vantage point where I don't have to panic. I've gotten used to, first I was panicking. Now that we've talked about it so many times, now I can talk about it without quite that level of panic. Maybe there's a little bit of arousal, but it's less than it was before. And then that gets a little better over time. And as I, and once with the help of did we lose Rav?
I think we did.
Looks like he just disappeared. He's reappearing. There you go. So yeah, you change the context under which, and so to some degree permanently change that association. So that next time in a normal situation, any old day, like, moment throughout the day, it's less likely to elicit that whole constellation of that fight or flight mode, self-persecutory thoughts, all of that.
Super fascinating listening to, having done a lot of my own therapy after, my husband died, and listening to and then looking at the success, because I look back to what the original was, and I know Rab would probably want to talk about this, but throwing after my husband died, they wanted to just throw an antidepressant at me. And I was like, wait, like, how's that? Like, I remember specifically asking, I'm like, well, I think this might have had something to do with his death. And I looked at her and I go, but aren't I supposed to hurt? Like, he died, and tragically, like, he died. And she goes, but you don't need to. And I'm like, yeah. And so I went through a ton of my own therapy and grief therapy, and then it's the stories that you told. And then, like, even just for example, I last week went back to Detroit 21 years later, and I said I was never going back to Detroit because that's where I got the phone call and my entire life fell apart. And I said, I'm never going back. But eventually, through years of doing stuff, it came back to, I had to face it, right? Which was that, like, actually, guess what, Kim? You're making all these stories up about Detroit, like, about everything that it represented. But the reality is that was 21 years ago. Here we're going to go back. I had to face it, and I had to, like, see it in a whole different light. So this is where I do think having, whether it was like the power boost of something like, like an MDMA that probably takes you out of, and maybe it makes it faster, like it doesn't take you years to go through something, or it gives you that different perspective to get you outside of your normal, like when I think about when you're asking about like the current and they're throwing drugs at people, like just throwing a drug at somebody, like the current antidepressants, a lot of times what I've heard in my years of working on it from people, PTSD to depression, anxiety, is that it numbs you. But ultimately, is that going to actually, because then it doesn't work. And then oftentimes doctors keep layering more stuff, and it becomes like, what's going on? Like it's chaos in somebody's life because there isn't the support, or there isn't so I am for, and I want other treatments. And that's why I want something like this. And unfortunately, there was too many things that were with the current Lycos. But I do think, when you're talking about all those different, therapies, it would be really interesting to go, what would have happened if you did that comparative to this plus versus,
right.
Because there is if the current way that they're treating, just throwing that drug, I'm not sure that from most, it's like it says it numbs, right? It numbs. It doesn't actually, which actually is a good thing sometimes, right? To not, to kind of bring it down. But at some
temporarily, yeah.
But at some point you do, that's part of that, also the human condition of you have to eventually face, there is some power in confidence that comes with when you face it. But, sometimes the numbing is what's needed, but other times you need that other perspective and compassion to yourself, and, seeing yourself from a different point of view, or the example that you used with the vet killing a kid in war, but he can't see himself differently. If you can get out of those kind of frameworks, and maybe that's really the benefit and why we need these tools. And I want to see this, because ultimately the way that you're describing, when we live in those things, that's hell for people, and it's a human, and then when you've had trauma on top of it, it makes it even worse. So,
yeah.
Thanks for all that, just your beautiful descriptions of all the different types.
That was really good, Matt. Yeah, I appreciate that. That was really good. I enjoyed that.
Pleasure.
So, for PTSD right now, the FDA has approved sertraline, if I'm saying that right, sertraline and paroxetine. I guess I just wanted to float that.
Zoloft and Paxil. Yeah.
Yeah. I just wanted to float that to you.
People
I guess
would know them by those names. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to float that to you, Kim, given your advocacy in the SSRI space. Do you have any strong opinions on using SSRIs for PTSD, or if they should be used at all or used minimally, or Any kind of sense on that?
I mean, I know that that's kind of the treatment, but I'm not really sure, that there's a lot of side effects that people have. There's ones that are known, but there's also sexual side effects. I hear from a lot of people that it doesn't get better. And so doctors often layer more drugs. We talked about antipsychotics being added, Abilify being one of them, because it's like all the advertising is if your antidepressants aren't working and you're still feeling this way, you need to add, and I call it Abilify. And so then people are getting layers and layers. And so that is why we're seeing a huge problem of polypharmacy within the mental health community, the PTS community. I hear it from vets all the time and then there's issues. So we do need better solutions. And I'm not sure that kind of quick fix pill. I think it is probably, and it's what I've really enjoyed about what Matt just said. There's probably therapies are expensive, not always covered from, people. I think that's part of the problem. And so, I think we need to do better.
Yeah. Do you see any utility for SSRIs for PTSD? Do you have any opinions on that? Or do you see in some cases it could be useful or?
Sure. Sure. If people, I think sometimes people want something and, it might help in that initial, but, if they were never really meant to be taken for years. And the reality is people are taking them for 20 years and then they can't get off of them. And that is also one of my concerns with, that people's bodies can't get off of these antidepressants. And so then they're got addicted to, it's not that they're addicted, like in the, the opioid sense, but their bodies can't get off of them.
There's a withdrawal syndrome.
Yeah. The withdrawal syndrome. They've had,
and some worse than others, like Effexor has a pretty bad one.
Had they had big lawsuits of withdrawal cases. There's been a lot and truthfully, there's been efficacy. There's been huge efficacy lawsuits against Zoloft, which is sertraline, because the efficacy doesn't exist. And so these are things that I do question. And I also think that if people are going to be on them, I always say you should have an exit strategy before you get on, like when you go and the doctors put you on, how long am I going to be on these things? People are on them for years and they don't seem to be doing anything. And then they have all the other things like the sexual dysfunction disorders that are coming out of it. And then imagine you're already struggling and then you have those issues. So it's just that it gets compounded. And so we do need better treatments. I'm 100% supportive of that.
Yeah. And one just small question. I know we chatted about this before we started rolling, that sexual dysfunction is not on the black box warning. That's very concerning because that's a very well-known risk. I'm just going to ask, is there any idea on what percentage risk there is of sexual dysfunction? Any kind of estimates that you might know of?
There's groups out there that's all their mission is right now is to get that put on the warning. It's pretty high. I mean, I think it's pretty high.
Okay.
That it eventually just kind of numbs. And then for people to even get off, getting off, it still exists. And so I think that's been a huge problem. And I think what we're seeing now is there's an entire community that's out there trying to work on helping people withdraw and get off of their psychotropic drugs, because and that's a big with the layered of the polypharmacy. So we do need something. I wish it wasn't the quick pill fix society, like just give me a pill to make it go away. Because I think, humans want to feel better. We want to, but so I do think we need to do. And then when you put the PTSD on top of it and you have the trauma on top of it and you have, you start looking at it, just keeps magnifying. So,
yeah. Okay. I'm going to try to summarize a couple things here, and we'll kind of get your last thoughts for both you guys. Kind of a question/comment, which relates to a broader point about the FDA, is that during the COVID vaccine, there were a lot of concerns about the use of emergency use authorization and the pushing of the COVID vaccine, particularly in younger people, absent any solid safety and efficacy data. And the FDA really, I think, did a bad job of representing the scientific method, conducting proper safety trials when it came to that. And you had two senior FDA officials who resigned in around December 2021 due to the agency's push for boosters in young people. Recently, there was some congressional event where one of those FDA officials expanded more on what that was like and how the agency was pushing these things absent any solid efficacy data. And the agency continues to promote the COVID vaccine in young people, toddlers and infants included. Last I checked, they still do that. And they've been doing that well into 2022, 2023, when there was no clear risk-benefit analysis. So that, the FDA really needs to step it up there. And a lot of people have lost trust in FDA and just public health agencies and medical science and science in general due to what happened during the COVID pandemic. And I guess there's two things with that as it relates to these MDMA studies. One, in terms of PTSD, 13 million Americans suffer from PTSD. Estimates show 5 to 6% of the population. From what I was reading today, women are more likely to be impacted by PTSD than men. So there are some interesting kind of feminist female coalitions on this being an issue that's disproportionately affecting women in some cases. And obviously you have veterans, individuals who've served in the military, who've suffered from this condition. And so is it, as it relates to our conversation, is there any potential kind of weight we can put on this being a crisis or a very prominent issue in the public, a mental health issue that warrants a lot of concern, investigation, and consideration for MDMA-assisted therapy, despite various concerns that Kim, you've articulated well, like similar to COVID. I mean, in the case of the COVID vaccine, I mean, a lot of corners were cut, and the FDA did a very sloppy job in approving the COVID vaccine, and then pushing more and more rounds of boosters, particularly in young people and people who had no benefit. So the answer is not that the FDA should just keep approving things based on some idea of an emergency or a mental health or physical health crisis. But in this particular case with PTSD and what we've talked about, MDMA having this established safety profile and very solid efficacy data, despite there being, again, some concerns around it, is that something we can weigh and consider in terms of approving this? Like, hypothetically, if we had 40% of the population or 60% of the population that had PTSD, like some ginormous number, would that, or should that be a consideration for then approving MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the FDA if the numbers were very, very high? If this was a true epidemic of, like, your next door neighbor has PTSD, that's like 1 out of 3 people have PTSD. I guess that's kind of a question for you, Kim and Matt, if you guys have any kind of final thoughts around that. And just lastly, which I've already kind of said, like just this double standards issue, which we've already talked about, of when it comes to the blinding issue, that's a very big issue when it comes to other drugs as well that are regularly approved by the FDA with no issue. Things like Ambien, Ritalin, Adderall, benzodiazepines, etc. And so there's a lot of concern that I have right now too, that the FDA has kind of one standard for what psychedelics, it seems to be, and a different standard for other drugs that get approved usually by bigger pharmaceutical companies. And there's all kinds of concerns about like conflicts of interest and perverse incentives, and why like Pfizer and Moderna got such an easy time with COVID vaccines, and here, Lykos, they're different things, but here Lykos had a very difficult time getting this approved. Granted, this was a very different case. and lastly, I would say generally, I'm still leaning towards, like, if I had to give an opinion, towards approving this, given the fact that PTSD is a challenging condition that many people are still suffering from, and the issue, as outlined already, with existing psychotherapies being the high dropout rate, and the many issues with the pharmacotherapies, particularly SSRIs, and kind of all the concerns that we talked about, which I kind of listed for myself. The blinding issue, the safety issue, the diversity, the 40% of users having taken MDMA, that bias. We talked about the sexual assault issue and the regulation of therapy. I mean, to me, all those are issues, but none of those appear to me as issues that would sway my opinion towards not approving it. Really, to me, the kind of big issues that really stuck out to me, and something I want to look more into, is what the Wall Street Journal reported, participants saying that therapists were very much emphasizing this being a monumental study and this changing history and helping many people. And as a result of that, individuals not reporting their suicidal ideation for fear of hampering this mission to save society and help others with PTSD. That potential underaccounting of adverse events, like that, to me is really the biggest issue that I was very concerned about. But in general, I still very cautiously would want this to be approved for the reason that people are very much suffering from this. But with, as Matt has alluded to before, very strong set of guidelines and protocols on what should be studied and looked at after approval. And the obvious point being that there's never going to be a perfect solution. Like there might be some lunatic therapist who might end up sexually abusing one of the participants. There might be some number of individuals with increased suicidal ideation. But for me, I'm fairly persuaded by not just the MAPS data, but other sets of data as well on MDMA and its efficacy for PTSD. I just said a lot here. I kind of want your guys' kind of last thoughts on that, in terms of the consideration of how big of a problem PTSD is and whether that should weigh into the decision on this. And I guess I'm curious for you in particular, Kim, like if the PTSD rates were much higher, like 70%, would that change the decision overall? And in general as well, the concern about double standards, about the way the COVID vaccine was handled and other psychiatric medications versus what many people are perceiving, I think rightly so, as MDMA having gotten a very different treatment.
Well, for starters, I don't know that I would say it's just PTSD. I think we have a growing mental health crisis in the country. So I do feel like the current treatments that we do have and the approaches are not working. So I do think that we need something. And in terms of the FDA, double standard was 100%. It was riddled with, it's constantly double standard. Like I look at what happened with the COVID vaccines. I look at what's continuing to happen with the COVID vaccines. I look at how the FDA, it's granted it's two different divisions, but there is, and even, you could almost even say with the Alzheimer's, the Aljahelm too, that it got approved, and there's been really a lot of controversy around that. So that is why, personally, I was very surprised when it did get rejected, because I thought, given all of that situation with COVID vaccines, the Aljahelm, and all of the issues there, I thought, well, for sure they're going to approve this because it's just kind of a pattern of, and so I was very surprised that this was held at a different, that there is a little bit of a double standard, or there was something a little bit different. I don't know if it's the psychedelic market, like if it's just psychedelics and the community, the country's not ready for it, or somebody's not ready for it. I don't know. But like, I do think when I look back at the last couple of years, the emergency use authorization, and knowing that they wasn't even based on data, like there was, mice data on some of the, on the boosters, which is like beyond anything. So, and I also think there was a bigger political agenda, but that's another whole podcast that I won't touch on. But I don't know. I think I don't understand, the mental health crisis keeps growing. And I think part of it, even with the pandemic, that all contributed to it. So, I think there is an issue. I think the fact is I was optimistically, going into this, wanting something. But I think with the concerns that I brought up, I just didn't think it was ready for prime time that I could put my name on it. But I also am not saying no to it. I would love, I know that there's other psychedelics that are coming down the market. I hope that there are things that they took from this that they can apply and make sure, even in the way it gets presented, that they can actually, that they don't run into some of the same issues. But I guess that's really what I would say is, I do know that I wish, because I did go into this thinking that I was going to probably be the opposite of what I normally do and vote yes. And I was very kind of disappointed in with what I saw, because it was not what I really wanted to see in the data. And so those were concerns that I just, in good conscience with what I do, I know that I'm always balancing hope and caution, and I know people want to be, hope is what people are hanging on. And I think it also needs to have that little bit of the balance of caution. So, I already think it is a crisis. Like, I don't know, because I think it's already a crisis, that I think I would still require, I think I would still have the same questions. I don't, maybe but I don't know that because once it's out, it's really like, if there were issues that did come down, I think there was just too many unknowns for me to like literally put a vote of regardless of, so I think I had too many question marks that were not satisfied for me to feel confident.
And one of the when you're talking about like if it's an epidemic and given the severity, the breakthrough status itself is a reflection of that it's already at that level of one, promising preliminary evidence combined with a severely unmet clinical need. That's kind of that latter part is the side you're talking about. So, and my answer to that is like, it's kind of like your example of the COVID vaccine, like makes the point. Like it works both ways. Like if Kim weighed the evidence that it was like, it didn't meet the standard, and, therefore that reflects a decision that like, there's a chance this could, cause more harm than good. That, on either, safety and or efficacy, if then you multiply the rates of, like you said, 5% instead of that, it's 70%. Well, then if there's a chance it's harming people, then you've also magnified the harm that's going to be done if like many more times people are going to receive this treatment. So it works both ways. So for my mind, just theoretically, however you weigh on it shouldn't be, it shouldn't affect your decision, whatever side you come down on. Because the harms, can be magnified the same as the potential efficacy. I think the clinical need highlights, the societal need highlights the need for the research to be done and for it to be fast tracked, which has happened. There's a whole lot of questions about the FDA. It sounds like there was miscommunication, things. I don't know how much that the FDA dropped the ball on. Sounds to me at least some things they dropped the ball on in terms of communicating to the sponsor, making it clear what they wanted, conveying to everyone involved what the standards they're expecting are and how evidence will be evaluated. And that's unfortunate. Yeah. The most important thing is that we can agree, like many of the concerns that have been raised are real concerns, and we need to take them seriously. And frankly, in the long term, like whether it's approved now or later, and I realize like there's people dying every day, like but nonetheless, in the very big picture, we're going to need to grapple with these issues, and it's going to be a tough decision to make. So I'd really like to see progress on like understanding the cult-like atmosphere surrounding this field, like how, we're conducting these trials, how we're addressing some of the experimental issues like the blinding but on the much bigger level, I think the most important one is this whole cult-like, the potential for abuses given the cult-like utopian vision of this field. And so I think kind of bigger than whatever my opinion on where we should fall on this is I think we need to really listen to each other. And I've seen just a lot of demonization of this was just big pharma squashing things, and a critique of some of the folks that like Nishay Devanad, who prompted the extended public hearing component. She, you can agree or disagree. I've heard some really bad mischaracterizations of her. I know her. I think she's acting in good faith. I've seen accusations of, these people don't want to help PTSD victims and she's being kind of criticized by something that someone who used to be in the same organization that she's affiliated with wrote some article that was linked to about saying vets are supporting, white supremacy and all. She didn't write that piece, she wants to help PTSD victims. She's just weighing things in a different way. And she wants it done in a way where, there's, where more benefit comes than harm. And so I would encourage, my biggest message is I want to encourage people to really have some good faith and really understanding the voices at play here, no matter what, and rather than picking a team, really learning. I've learned more in this conversation than I have probably taught anyone anything. So I want to just continue to learn about the perspectives and what, I've learned a lot about from Kim, how her and the rest of the advisory panel were, weighing different factors. So I do think that aspect of this, we're saving humanity, utopian vision, for me, that's the most difficult one. And how do we minimize the harms that come from that over time, which I think, played at least some degree of, played a pretty big role in some of the missteps that happened here, at least as an overall context.
Yeah. I totally agree with you, Matt. And one thing which I may have mentioned before, also in general, a concern that you and I shared, Matt, and Kim, you might as well, which is this general view that many of the scientists, psychiatrists, doctors that were on the advisory committee were really out of their depth and really lacked the kind of experience and knowledge to give what felt like a fair assessment or reading of this. It didn't really seem like they were very knowledgeable about psychedelics. I think a lot of people are rightly concerned about that being a very big issue, right?
I think, it's funny because I remember even actually asking her, is this the right committee? And she goes, you guys are the experts. Because I said, we need other. And I also think what might have been nice on the committee is maybe having, I do think the different kind of perspectives is interesting. I appreciate, Matt, that you said, or both of you saying, mischaracterizing some of the people on it, intentions, and being, just that's what I've seen. And I've seen it with COVID vaccines. I've seen it you're on this team, you hate this team. That whole division does not work. And so we will never get anywhere if we can't have conversations. So I loved this conversation. I learned so much from, just even this is how things get better, right? This is what science actually is and how we can improve things, or, community and whatnot. But I will say that I do wonder, if I look at that FDA advisory committee, could there have been somebody who represented, somebody like you, Matt, who is in the psychedelic research? Could they have added a psychedelic person on the committee that could have helped round it out? Because I do think that having a consumer rep like me, and who has a different perspective than a psychiatrist, who has something different than the VA psychiatrists, because there were couples of VA psychiatrists that were on this. But, a lot of those guys got completely lambasted by saying that they're just in bed with pharma, which, I'm always the biggest one out talking about big pharma. But that's not necessarily fair either, to say that the FDA was only about protecting the profits of big pharma and their drugs and the psychiatrists. I just think there probably was an opportunity to have, either it wasn't the right group to have this conversation, or as they said it was, then they should have put maybe a couple of psychedelic people as temporary members. And that could have been a really important part and a missing component that could have offered a different perspective into having this well-rounded conversation. And that would be my advice for the next advisory committee that comes forward, that they have some temporary people that are from the psychedelic field, whether research or whatnot, because I think that is a very unique perspective that is different than probably what other people have on the committee.
Matt, lastly, since we were all kind of giving our opinions on this, I definitely understand your opinion because we've been talking before this conversation as well. But for people who may not know, can you just quickly summarize in however way you want why you would still lean on approving it? I mean, we spent in this podcast, we spent a lot of time talking about concerns and issues, which I think is great.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is not a podcast on the efficacy of MDMA. And by the way, for people who want to check it out, I've done a podcast with Rick Doblin already a few months ago where we talked about why he chose MDMA early on, which was fascinating. Why he paired MDMA with PTSD instead of psilocybin for there's a very fascinating process. Mm-hmm. And him talking about what these experiences are like, what the protocols are, going deep into that. That's a different conversation that people can check out. But Matt, do you want to kind of finish this by just kind of saying why you still feel like the FDA should have approved it?
Main reason is because I'm convinced from everything we know about MDMA and from the evidence in these trials that the efficacy is real. And I don't think, while there's always potential for things to be inflated by placebo effect and hype, my judgment is that it's pretty convincing that there's a substantial effect here. And honestly, part of that is just from a really, and I realize there's a date, we need to be based on the data, but I also combine those data with in my course of doing this work, not just the work that I've done with psilocybin, but also interviewing and talking with people who have healed through MDMA therapy, including for PTSD. It's just you triangulate all that into a really credible package. It makes sense. Everything we know about the neuroscience of how it's working, the stories of what people, and it's so convincing when it works. It works really well. And I think that's reflected in the data. And so, to me, and maybe I'm too hopeful, but I would hope, I obviously share a lot of the concerns on the safety side, but I lean more on the side of continued heavy monitoring with the requirement for additional, phase 4 data once it's in treatment, and with a very strong REMS program. So it's really just my being convinced by the efficacy data that there is something very solid there and something very different, that as far as a medication, nothing else, everything else just treats symptoms, which for something like this, the only things that really are going to work well are things that resolve this psychological conflict, this deep-seated trauma, this distorted view of oneself and how they're interacting in the world. And this can do that. The way that some of these therapies we talked about can do, but I think with the potential for a much higher chance of it working, because it's sort of like on rocket boosters. You have that pharmacological facilitation, but done in a way that healing can stick. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great kind of conclusion for the podcast, because I think that what you've just said, Matt, I think that articulates, in contrast with Kim, what you've been talking about, two very different perspectives on this. And so what Matt is saying, something that I would share, as someone who's been researching this for the past 4 years, and full disclosure, I mean, people know this already, but I myself have done MDMA therapy, not for PTSD, but just, I mean, these are kind of clinical diagnoses, but just depression, anxiety, life is hard, whatever. And I've had very beneficial, very healing experiences. And so, for people like Matt, people like myself, we're looking at this as like, we know people who've done this, or, we've done this ourselves. We've looked at the data, we've read the stories, we watched all the documentaries, and we've heard Joe Rogan spend hours and hours interview guests about like this whole area. Like, we have a particular kind of experience, but from the experience, I think for you, Kim, and other people in the advisory committee, it's much more, I think, focused on MAPS, on Lykos, and their particular issues and the way they've handled MDMA and potential undercounting of various issues, the kind of utopian vision, that one sexual assault case, which unfortunately, forever is going to be kind of associated with MDMA or with MAPS or Lykos generally. And like those particular issues were very much front and center on that side. But for people like Matt and I, who've been looking at this for much earlier than this particular FDA hearing and FDA decision, we're coming at it from just a different perspective, where we see a lot of hope and potential, kind of irrespective of Lykos and MAPS. But again, that's just kind of goes to show the differing perspectives, because for the FDA, and for the advisory committee, it was the Lykos trials and what is Lykos doing, and their therapists and their protocols. So I think that's
Can I
that.
just say,
Yeah.
I want to just respond to that, because
go ahead.
One of my concerns is, I mean, yes, that's what our application was, right? As the FDA, they're not looking at the field per se, but I will say for me personally, what if this impacted the entire field going forward? And so I do look at it, because I do think that there is a hope. And to what you said about like the use of these, psychedelics in different type of modes. What if this actually impact or hurt the entire field by not doing it and coming out with all of this baggage, whether it's a Lykos or not? And I think it, unfortunately or fortunately, and I give them a lot of credit for being the first out there, because they also were probably the heavily criticized, and also with the lens was on it and a filter, because this is any company has come forward on an FDA approval. So I give them a lot of credit for being the first. They also took the hit, but they might have also protected the industry.
Yeah.
And I think the whole field has learned from it, and that's what I'm most excited about. The commonality. It's in the biggest picture. It's less about whether you would have voted for or against, but it's more about, I think everyone's like common interest here is like, in the big picture, we want this to be done in the right way that minimizes harm and to maximize the ability to help people. And people are just, weighing, different ways to go about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. I think that's true. Although I'm also concerned, something you said earlier, Matt, which probably for another podcast for sure, just about other companies like Compass not including psychotherapy in their treatment, when anyone who knows anything about psychedelics knows it's psychedelic-assisted therapy. It's not you just put someone in a room with 5 grams of mushrooms and bye-bye. Like it's you have someone there helping you through it. The therapy,
but
component.
To be fair, they are providing support and preparation. So that's why I say nominal therapy. So
right.
There's a lot of nuance there. So they're not doing that. They're not putting someone in a room and
like
giving them a hide.
Like they have guides still in the experience.
Exactly. And they're just not going through CBT or the Lykos, which is kind of an idiosyncratic therapy, but informed by, internal family systems, et cetera.
Right. So they don't have an integration.
They're not going.
They don't have an integration process of therapy, because that's a critical part of psychedelics, right? The therapy after
they do have some. I'm not sure if they're calling it that.
Yeah.
But,
right.
So it's. There's a lot of nuance there.
Yeah, and that could be a particular concern if in the future, like it's less emphasis on therapy and you have companies trying to approve psychedelics, and in their trials, there's this kind of therapeutic-ish support, but not as much of a robust psychotherapy involved. Could that then lower the results? Because again, anyone who knows anything about psychedelics knows the preparation and the integration afterwards is kind of more important than the thing itself. It's like, what have you learned? All right, how am I going to treat people differently? How am I going to treat myself differently after the experience? So I hope that doesn't turn out to be an issue in, again, stemming from the fact that the FDA doesn't regulate therapy, that being a big issue, as we've talked about. I hope we don't go too far in the other direction of not emphasizing therapy enough as a result of the FDA, not being able to specialize in this area. Yeah. Thanks, guys. This was great. This is definitely the longest podcast I've ever done. And I'm confident. I'm confident this is the best, I think, document on this particular issue. I don't think anyone else is having this kind of conversation with very differing perspectives. Kim, part of the advisory committee as a consumer rep, and Matt, I'm very grateful for you. We've been talking for the last couple of years on your experience with psychedelic therapy, running the studies at Johns Hopkins, which have totally changed the field. You guys both come from very different areas, and I don't think anyone else is having this particular kind of conversation. So I'm very glad for both of you coming on and giving your time and sharing your perspective. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, kudos to you for having the ability and the knowledge to bring us together, because I've learned a lot from Matt, and this is an area that I'm like super intrigued by. So for me personally, so I'm going to start doing more of my deep dives like I've done, because I think there's so much potential in this area.
Right. And I've really valued like getting this input from Kim and learning about your history, and wow, like kudos. And like Rav was saying earlier, it's like, gosh, I'm so sorry for the feedback you got, and that's just not deserved. You're a hero in doing the work that you're doing and advocating for safety, given the experience you've gone through. And, this is a really critical lens that you're putting on it. So yeah, thanks. And yeah, thanks for braving that horrible noise that you've been,
unfortunately, I'm the least popular. It's always that least popular, but it's an important one, because even that small percent, if it is you, it's your 100%, and harms never get talked about. It's not the sexy part of the business. It just isn't. But so I love that you had this conversation. I also love being challenged. And I'm certainly am one that I have said all the time, like, if I say something that's incorrect, or if somebody wants to say, I'm not. I've always said part of our problem is that we're afraid to try on a different point of view, and that gets us locked into something, and we don't move, and that hurts society. It hurts advancement in medicine, and it hurts advancement in relationships with people. So I think we have to be open and be willing to be wrong, and be willing to be challenged, and to have tough conversations and hear both sides, all sides.
Yeah. And we've already said, people should not be attacking you. Like, anyone listening to this will know you're acting in earnest. And also for people to know, and we can cut this out in case you don't want this in here, Kim, because we were saying this before we started the conversation yesterday for part one. You yourself have had a very positive and powerful and spiritually meaningful experience with psilocybin last year, given your personal history with your husband, and I'm sure all the many issues one could intuitively suspect you would go through emotionally. So you're not anti-psychedelic. You've had a very powerful experience with psilocybin in particular, and I'd love to potentially get you on to talk about that at some point. But you're not some crazy like psychedelics are bad, or you've done it yourself, and as you had said before we started, it was very spiritually meaningful and healing for you. So
it was pretty profound. So
So
I'm not anti, just as the same as I always say, I'm not anti-drug. I'm not anti this. I'm just pro-information, pro-transparency, and pro-conversation. So I'd be more than willing to have that conversation.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe you guys can link up at some point because I know Matt's always doing research on psilocybin. There's always some kind of survey happening who knows, you might be useful for some kind of survey for your psilocybin experience.
Yeah.
I know that they're always doing like surveys on like psilocybin for, chronic pain, eating disorders, or, in your case, if it was grief or depression or whatever it may be. Yeah, who knows? You and Matt might be collaborating soon.
Yeah, and some of the most interesting stuff is on the safety side. So that's what there's the most to be learned about. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. Share this podcast. Like I said, I think this is the best conversation on this topic there is, if I can be so arrogant to say, on the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Feel free to share it on Spotify, Apple, subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever you're listening to this podcast, and subscribe to our newsletter, the Illusion of Consensus Substack. That's where you can follow us for future episodes. And I guess I should throw it back to you guys too, if you want to mention your social media or anything else, newsletter, website. Kim?
You can follow me at the Accidental Advocate on Substack, and then Woody Matters on Twitter.
We'll link to that below.
And my best would be on X, or formerly known as Twitter, drug_researcher. And post a good amount about psychedelics mainly. Yeah,
and who knows, maybe soon to be a psychedelic podcaster, Matt. We'll see.
We'll have to see.
Maybe the next big podcaster. Stay tuned for Matt's upcoming podcast future. We'll see.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.